Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Tonight, I want to tell you a story that proves that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the darkest circumstances. This isn't a tale of unsolved mysteries or endless questions, this is a story of redemption, courage, and how one woman's decision to finally speak the truth unraveled a web of lies that had persisted for 4 decades. We're going back to the summer of 1983, to the small industrial town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where a beloved high school teacher's brutal murder shocked a tight-knit community. But our story doesn't end with her death, it follows a twisted path through decades of silence, fear, and buried secrets, until a single phone call in 2023 changed everything. This is a story about the weight of keeping deadly secrets, the courage it takes to break a silence that has lasted a lifetime, and how sometimes justice arrives not through brilliant detective work or advanced forensics, but through the simple, powerful act of telling the truth. So pour yourself a cup of coffee, settle into your favorite chair, and let me take you through a case that reminds us that it's never too late to do the right thing, and that sometimes, the most important witness is the one you never expected to speak. Margaret Maggie Sullivan had the kind of presence that made students actually want to come to English class. At 34, she possessed that rare combination of warmth and authority that marked the truly gifted teachers. Her students at Millbrook High School would later remember her animated discussions of Shakespeare, her patient help with college applications, and the way she somehow made everyone feel like their ideas mattered. Maggie lived alone in a small Victorian house on Elm Street, just 6 blocks from the school where she had taught for 12 years. She had never married, not from lack of opportunity, but because she seemed to pour all her maternal instincts into her students. Her house was always open to kids who needed extra help, a safe place to talk, or just somewhere to belong. The summer of 1983 was typical for Millbrook, a town of 8,000 people nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania. The steel mill that employed half the town was still running strong, and Friday night football games in the fall remained the social event of the week. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and where a teacher like Maggie Sullivan could walk home alone after evening tutoring sessions without a second thought. That changed on the night of July 23, 1983. Maggie had spent the evening at the school, helping 3 students with their college entrance essays. The janitor, Pete Morrison, remembered seeing her car still in the parking lot when he locked up the building at 9:30 p.m. Her neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, saw Maggie's porch light come on around 10:15 p.m., which was typical for Maggie's arrival home. What happened next would haunt Millbrook for the next 40 years. The next morning, when Maggie failed to show up for her summer school class, the principal, Robert Hayes, called her house. When there was no answer, he drove to Elm Street to check on her. He found Maggie's front door standing open and her car keys on the kitchen counter. Maggie herself was found in her living room, the victim of what the medical examiner would later determine was extreme violence. The crime scene was devastating. Maggie had been beaten and strangled, and the house showed signs of a violent struggle. Furniture was overturned, books were scattered across the floor, and there were clear signs that Maggie had fought desperately for her life. The brutality of the attack shocked even seasoned investigators. Detective Ray Kowalski of the Millbrook Police Department caught the case. A 20-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness, Kowalski had worked exactly 3 homicides in his career. Millbrook wasn't that kind of town. But he approached Maggie's case with the methodical care that had made him one of the most respected officers in the county. The initial investigation revealed no obvious suspects. Maggie had no enemies that anyone could identify. She wasn't dating anyone seriously, had no financial problems, and her relationships with colleagues and students seemed uniformly positive. The house hadn't been robbed, her purse was untouched, and a jewelry box containing several valuable pieces remained undisturbed on her bedroom dresser. But Detective Kowalski noticed something that would prove crucial decades later: the attack seemed personal. The level of violence was far beyond what would be necessary to simply kill someone. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random attack. Someone had wanted Maggie Sullivan to suffer. The investigation into Maggie's murder consumed Millbrook in the summer of 1983. Detective Kowalski interviewed hundreds of people, current and former students, fellow teachers, neighbors, shopkeepers, anyone who might have had contact with Maggie in the days before her death. The 3 students she had been tutoring that final evening were thoroughly investigated and cleared. Tommy Brennan, Lisa Martinez, and Kevin Walsh had all gone straight home after the tutoring session, and their alibis were solid. All 3 were devastated by their teacher's death and eager to help in any way they could. Kowalski expanded his investigation to include former students who might have harbored grudges against Maggie. He looked into her personal life, her family relationships, even her college years. He examined every aspect of her routine, looking for patterns that might have made her a target. One lead that seemed promising involved a recent incident at the school. 3 weeks before her murder, Maggie had reported to Principal Hayes that she was concerned about the behavior of a former student named Danny Cartwright. Danny, now 22 and working at the steel mill, had shown up at the school several times asking to see Maggie. According to Hayes, Maggie had said Danny seemed agitated and not quite right. Detective Kowalski brought Danny in for questioning. The young man was clearly troubled. He had dropped out of high school in his senior year, had a history of minor scrapes with the law, and had been drinking heavily since his father's death the previous winter. But his alibi for the night of July 23 was solid. He had been at Murphy's bar until closing time, then had gone home with a woman named Carol Stevens. Both the bartender and Carol confirmed his story. As summer turned to fall, the leads began to dry up. Detective Kowalski had investigated every possible angle, followed every tip, and interviewed every person who had any connection to Maggie Sullivan. The case was no closer to being solved than it had been on the morning her body was discovered. The Pennsylvania State Police were called in to assist, bringing additional resources and expertise. They conducted their own investigation, re-interviewed key witnesses, and even brought in a criminal profiler from the FBI. The profile suggested they were looking for someone who knew Maggie personally, someone who felt wronged or rejected by her, possibly a former student or colleague. But despite the expanded investigation, no arrests were made. By the end of 1983, Maggie Sullivan's murder had joined the ranks of unsolved cases that haunt small-town police departments across America. The impact of Maggie's unsolved murder on Millbrook was profound and lasting. Parents became more protective of their children. Women stopped walking alone after dark. The easy trust that had characterized the community began to erode, replaced by suspicion and unease. Detective Kowalski never stopped working the case. Even as other investigations demanded his attention, he would return to Maggie's file, rereading witness statements, looking for connections he might have missed. He maintained contact with the state police investigators and followed up on occasional tips that came in from the public. In 1985, there was a brief moment of hope when a similar murder occurred in a town about 60 miles away. A female teacher had been killed in her home under circumstances that seemed to mirror Maggie's murder. But investigation revealed that the crimes were unconnected. The second case was solved when the victim's ex-husband was arrested and confessed. Detective Kowalski retired in 1995, but not before ensuring that Maggie's case file was complete and organized for his successor. He had spent 12 years working the case, and his failure to solve it remained one of the great regrets of his career. The case was inherited by Detective Sarah Mitchell, a young investigator who had grown up in Millbrook and remembered the fear that had gripped the community after Maggie's murder. Mitchell brought fresh eyes to the investigation, but she faced the same obstacles that had stymied Kowalski. The physical evidence was limited, the witness statements had been thoroughly exhausted, and the trail had grown cold. Over the years, Mitchell would occasionally get tips about the case. Someone would call in with a theory, or a name, or a half-remembered conversation from decades earlier. She followed up on every lead, no matter how unlikely, but none led to a breakthrough. The case gained renewed attention in 2003, 20 years after the murder, when a local newspaper ran a series of articles about unsolved crimes in the area. The article about Maggie's case prompted several phone calls to the police, but again, nothing substantial emerged. By 2010, nearly everyone directly involved in the original investigation had retired or died. Detective Mitchell was nearing retirement herself, and she worried that Maggie's case would be forgotten entirely. She made sure that all the case files were digitized and that her replacement understood the importance of keeping the case active, even if it seemed hopeless. The case file was thick with accumulated reports, witness statements, tips, and theories. But somewhere in that file, buried among hundreds of pages of documentation, was information that would eventually prove crucial to solving the case. The problem was that no one knew which piece of information mattered. While detectives pursued dead ends and false leads, the truth about Maggie Sullivan's murder was known to exactly 3 people. And for 40 years, they kept that secret buried under layers of fear, shame, and self-preservation. Angela Morrison had been 17 years old in the summer of 1983. She was the daughter of Pete Morrison, the school janitor, and she had been struggling academically and socially throughout her high school years. Angela was shy to the point of near invisibility, the kind of student who sat in the back of the classroom and hoped never to be called upon. But Maggie Sullivan had seen something in Angela that others missed. She had quietly arranged for Angela to get extra help in math, had encouraged her to join the school newspaper, and had even helped her family apply for financial aid for college. To Angela, Maggie wasn't just a teacher, she was a lifeline, proof that someone cared about her future. Which made what happened on July 23, 1983, all the more devastating. Angela had been walking home from her job at the local diner around 10:30 p.m. when she decided to take a shortcut through the alley behind Elm Street. As she passed behind Maggie's house, she heard voices, loud, angry voices coming from inside. Curious and concerned for her beloved teacher, Angela crept closer to the back of the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see into the living room where Maggie was facing 2 people Angela recognized, Brian Mitchell, a 25-year-old who had graduated from Millbrook High 5 years earlier, and his girlfriend, Janet Reeves. Brian Mitchell came from one of Millbrook's more prominent families. His father owned the largest car dealership in town, and Brian had been a star athlete in high school. But his life after graduation had been a series of disappointments and failures. He had dropped out of college after 2 semesters, lost several jobs due to his drinking and unreliability, and had developed a reputation as someone who couldn't live up to his potential. Janet Reeves was 2 years younger than Brian and completely devoted to him. She had dropped out of high school to move in with him, despite the objections of her family. Her relationship with Brian was tumultuous and often violent, but she seemed unable to break away from him. What Angela witnessed through that kitchen window was an argument that was rapidly escalating into violence. She could hear Brian's voice, slurred with alcohol, demanding something from Maggie. She heard Maggie's voice, firm and disapproving, refusing whatever Brian was asking for. Then Angela saw Brian grab Maggie by the shoulders and shake her violently. She saw Maggie break free and run toward the front of the house. She saw Brian and Janet chase after her. What happened next was seared into Angela's memory forever. Through the living room window, she watched as Brian struck Maggie with what appeared to be a heavy bookend. She watched as Maggie fell to the floor. She watched as Brian continued to hit her, even after she had stopped moving. Angela stood frozen in the backyard, too shocked to move, too terrified to scream. She watched as Brian and Janet stood over Maggie's motionless body, arguing in hushed tones about what to do next. She watched as they wiped down surfaces with towels from the kitchen. She watched as they left through the front door, carefully closing it behind them. And then Angela ran. She ran home through the dark streets of Millbrook, her heart pounding, her mind reeling with what she had witnessed. She burst through the front door of her family's small house and locked herself in her bedroom, where she sat on her bed, shaking and crying, trying to process what she had seen. When her father came home an hour later, Angela considered telling him what had happened. But fear held her back. Fear of Brian Mitchell, who came from a powerful family and had a violent temper. Fear of getting involved in something so terrible. Fear that no one would believe her. So Angela kept quiet. The next morning, when news of Maggie's murder spread through town, Angela said nothing. When Detective Kowalski interviewed her father as part of his investigation into everyone connected to the school, Angela said nothing. When her own guilt and trauma began manifesting in nightmares and panic attacks, she still said nothing. Brian Mitchell's reaction to news of Maggie's murder was perfect in its calculation. He expressed shock and sadness, attended the funeral with apparent grief, and even approached Detective Kowalski to offer his help with the investigation. He had an alibi for the night in question. He and Janet had been at a party at a friend's house, with multiple witnesses who could vouch for their presence. What Detective Kowalski didn't know was that the party had been hastily arranged after the murder. Brian had called several friends, told them he and Janet were coming over, and asked them to provide an alibi if anyone asked. In the close-knit world of Millbrook's young adults, loyalty to friends often trumped loyalty to truth, especially when the friend was from one of the town's leading families. Janet Reeves was a more problematic accomplice. Unlike Brian, she was consumed by guilt over what had happened. She had nightmares, lost weight, and began drinking heavily to cope with her knowledge of the crime. But her devotion to Brian, combined with her fear of the consequences of telling the truth, kept her silent. The pressure nearly broke her in 1985, 2 years after the murder. During a particularly severe bout of depression and drinking, Janet confided in her sister, Carol, about what had really happened that night. Carol was horrified and begged Janet to go to the police, but Janet refused, terrified of what Brian might do to her if she betrayed him. Carol Reeves faced an agonizing choice. She could report what her sister had told her, but that would destroy Janet and potentially put her in danger from Brian. Or she could keep the secret and live with the knowledge that a murderer was walking free in their community. She chose silence, a decision that would haunt her for decades. Meanwhile, Angela Morrison was struggling with her own demons. The trauma of witnessing Maggie's murder had derailed her life. She dropped out of high school in her senior year, moved away from Millbrook, and spent the next several decades battling depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. She moved frequently, holding temporary jobs and temporary relationships, never able to settle anywhere for long. The secret of what she had witnessed was like a poison in her life. She considered suicide multiple times, convinced that she was as guilty as the people who had actually committed the murder. She had failed to save Maggie, failed to get justice for her, failed to be the kind of person Maggie had believed she could be. Angela's father, Pete Morrison, knew something was wrong with his daughter, but he never suspected the truth. He watched her spiral into self-destruction with the helpless frustration of a parent who wants to help but doesn't know how. When Angela moved away from Millbrook in 1985, Pete hoped a fresh start would help her heal, but the distance only seemed to make things worse. For nearly 4 decades, the secret of Maggie Sullivan's murder was held by 3 women who were connected by their knowledge of the truth but isolated by their inability to speak it. Angela Morrison spent years in and out of therapy, struggling with what therapists diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. But she could never bring herself to tell any of them about the specific trauma that had shaped her life. The few times she came close to confessing, fear would overwhelm her, and she would retreat back into silence. Carol Reeves lived with the constant anxiety of knowing that her sister was living with a murderer. Brian and Janet's relationship continued for several more years, marked by increasing violence and instability. Carol watched her sister become a shadow of her former self, but Janet refused all offers of help or suggestions that she leave Brian. The relationship finally ended in 1988 when Brian was arrested for assault in a bar fight. Janet used his brief time in jail to disappear, moving across the country to California where she tried to build a new life. But like Angela, she found that geography couldn't heal the wounds of carrying such a terrible secret. Janet changed her name, found work as a waitress, and tried to forget her past. But Maggie Sullivan's ghost followed her wherever she went. Every news story about an unsolved murder, every TV show about cold cases, every mention of justice denied would send her into a spiral of guilt and self-recrimination. Brian Mitchell, meanwhile, seemed to thrive after escaping consequences for his crime. He eventually took over his father's car dealership, married a woman from a respectable family, and became a pillar of the Millbrook community. He served on the school board, sponsored Little League teams, and was frequently praised in the local newspaper for his civic involvement. But those who knew him well saw a different side. His wife divorced him after 10 years, citing his drinking and violent temper. His business practices were questionable, leading to several lawsuits and complaints to the Better Business Bureau. He had become exactly the kind of man who would be capable of murder. The question was whether anyone would ever be able to prove it. Detective Mitchell, no relation to Brian, continued to work the case throughout her career, but as the years passed, it seemed increasingly unlikely that it would ever be solved. The physical evidence was limited, and with each passing year, potential witnesses died or moved away, and memories faded. By 2020, Detective Mitchell had retired, and the case had been assigned to Detective James Crawford, a young investigator who had grown up hearing stories about the Sullivan murder but had no personal connection to it. Crawford reviewed the file periodically, but he had little hope of making progress on a case that had stumped investigators for nearly 4 decades. That changed with a single phone call on a cold February night in 2023. Angela Morrison was 60 years old and living in a small apartment in Phoenix, Arizona, when she finally found the courage to pick up the phone. She had been following news coverage of several cold cases that had been solved using modern investigative techniques, and she had been thinking more and more about Maggie Sullivan. The immediate trigger was her father's death. Pete Morrison had passed away the previous month, and Angela had returned to Millbrook for his funeral. Being back in the town where her trauma had occurred, seeing the people who still remembered Maggie with such love and respect, had reawakened her sense of guilt and responsibility. But there was something else that gave Angela the strength to finally speak. She was dying. A diagnosis of pancreatic cancer had given her perhaps 6 months to live, and she realized that if she didn't tell the truth now, she never would. It was 11:47 p.m. on February 15, 2023, when Detective Crawford's phone rang at the station. He was working late, catching up on paperwork, when he heard the voice of a woman who sounded nervous but determined. "My name is Angela Morrison," the caller said. "I need to tell you about the murder of Margaret Sullivan." Detective Crawford had worked enough cold cases to know that middle-of-the-night calls from people claiming to have information about decades-old crimes were usually from people with mental health issues or attention-seeking behavior. But something about Angela's voice, its quiet intensity, its obvious pain, made him pay attention. "I was there," Angela continued. "I saw who killed her. I've kept this secret for 40 years, and I can't die with it still inside me." Over the next 2 hours, Angela told Detective Crawford everything she had witnessed that night in 1983. She described the argument between Maggie and Brian Mitchell, the escalation to violence, the murder itself, and the cover-up that followed. She provided details about the scene that had never been made public, details that only someone who had actually been there could have known. Detective Crawford took careful notes, asking questions to clarify details and test the consistency of Angela's story. By the end of the call, he was convinced that he was talking to a genuine witness, possibly the key to solving one of the county's most notorious cold cases. But Angela's story came with complications. She was terminally ill and living across the country. Her testimony would be the word of a single witness about events that had occurred 4 decades earlier. And the man she was accusing, Brian Mitchell, was now a prominent member of the community with resources to mount a vigorous defense. Detective Crawford knew he would need more than Angela's testimony to build a case that could survive in court. The investigation that followed Angela's phone call was one of the most complex and delicate in the Millbrook Police Department's history. Detective Crawford knew he had to move carefully. Brian Mitchell was still a powerful figure in the community, and any premature action could alert him to the investigation and give him time to prepare his defense. Crawford's first step was to verify as much of Angela's story as possible. He began by examining the original case files, looking for details that corroborated her account. He found several pieces of evidence that aligned with what Angela had described, including the position of Maggie's body and the weapon that had been used in the attack. More importantly, he found inconsistencies in Brian Mitchell's original alibi. When Crawford re-interviewed some of the people who had claimed Brian was at a party that night, several admitted that their memories were hazy and that they might have been mistaken about the timing. One person, now in his 60s and suffering from the long-term effects of alcoholism, broke down and admitted that Brian had asked him to lie to the police. Crawford also tracked down Janet Reeves, now living under a different name in San Diego. When he approached her, she initially denied any knowledge of the murder, but faced with Angela's testimony and the possibility of being charged as an accessory, she eventually confessed her role in the crime. Janet's account corroborated Angela's in almost every detail. She described how Brian had become obsessed with Maggie Sullivan, whom he blamed for his failures in life. In his warped thinking, Maggie represented all the people who had expected more from him than he was capable of delivering. His resentment had festered for years until it exploded in violence that night in July 1983. According to Janet, Brian had been drinking heavily that evening and had decided to confront Maggie about a recommendation letter she had refused to write for him years earlier when he was trying to get into a different college. The confrontation had quickly escalated, and when Maggie threatened to call the police, Brian had snapped. Janet also provided details about the cover-up that followed. Brian had made several phone calls that night, arranging alibis and enlisting friends to provide false testimony. He had cleaned the crime scene and coached Janet on what to say if anyone asked questions. With Janet's confession and Angela's eyewitness testimony, Detective Crawford had enough evidence to make an arrest. But he wanted to be absolutely certain of his case before moving forward. He spent several more weeks gathering additional evidence, including financial records that showed Brian had made unusual cash payments to several people in the weeks following the murder, payments that appeared to be bribes for their silence. On March 22, 2023, nearly 40 years after Maggie Sullivan's murder, Detective Crawford and a team of officers arrived at Brian Mitchell's home with an arrest warrant. Brian, now 65 years old and still living in Millbrook, was taken into custody without incident. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Brian Mitchell had been a fixture in Millbrook for decades, serving on various civic committees and maintaining the facade of a respectable businessman. The idea that he had been living among them as a murderer for 4 decades was almost incomprehensible to many residents. The news media picked up the story immediately, and it became a sensation throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. The case had all the elements that capture public attention: a beloved victim, a decades-long mystery, a powerful suspect who had hidden in plain sight, and a deathbed confession that had finally brought the truth to light. Brian's initial response was to deny everything. His lawyer, one of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in the state, claimed that his client was the victim of false accusations by troubled individuals seeking attention. He pointed to Brian's standing in the community and his lack of any criminal record related to violence. But as more details of the case became public, Brian's support began to erode. People who had known him for years began to remember incidents that seemed more sinister in light of the charges against him. His ex-wife came forward with stories of his violent temper and controlling behavior. Former employees described a man who was capable of explosive rage when things didn't go his way. Janet Reeves agreed to testify against Brian in exchange for a reduced charge. Her testimony, combined with Angela's eyewitness account, painted a devastating picture of the events of July 23, 1983. Angela Morrison flew to Pennsylvania for the trial, despite her deteriorating health. Her testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Weak from cancer treatment but strong in her resolve, she told the jury about the night that had haunted her for 40 years. "I was 17 years old," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious pain. "Maggie Sullivan was the kindest person I had ever known. She believed in me when no one else did. And I watched her die, and I said nothing. I've lived with that shame every day since then. I can't take back my silence, but I can tell the truth now. The trial of Brian Mitchell began in September 2023 and lasted for 3 weeks. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Patricia Wells, methodically built their case around the testimonies of Angela Morrison and Janet Reeves, supported by physical evidence and the inconsistencies in Brian's original alibi. The defense attempted to discredit both women, pointing to Angela's history of mental health issues and Janet's decades of silence about the crime. They argued that the testimony was unreliable after so many years and that there was no physical evidence directly linking Brian to the murder. But the jury was convinced by the emotional power of the testimony and the detailed consistency of the accounts provided by both women. After deliberating for just 6 hours, they returned a verdict of guilty on charges of first-degree murder. Brian Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing hearing, he finally showed some emotion, breaking down as he addressed Maggie's family members who had waited 40 years for justice. "I can't take back what I did," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was young and drunk and angry, and I destroyed so many lives that night. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but it's all I have." Maggie's sister, who had traveled from California for the trial, spoke about the impact of the crime on their family. 40 years, she said. 40 years of wondering, of hoping, of never being able to truly grieve because we didn't have answers. Maggie was the best of us, and she deserved so much better than what happened to her. But at least now we know the truth. Angela Morrison attended the sentencing, though her cancer had progressed significantly during the months since her initial phone call. She died peacefully in a hospice facility in Phoenix just 2 weeks after Brian's conviction, finally free from the burden she had carried for most of her adult life. The resolution of Maggie Sullivan's murder had profound effects that extended far beyond the courtroom. For the community of Millbrook, it meant the end of a mystery that had haunted them for 4 decades, but it also meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that they had been living alongside a murderer without knowing it. The case also prompted a review of other unsolved crimes in the area. Detective Crawford and his team began re-examining cold cases, looking for connections to Brian Mitchell or other instances where false alibis might have protected criminals. While no other murders were linked to Brian, the investigation did lead to the resolution of several other long-dormant cases. Janet Reeves, who had cooperated with prosecutors, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for her role as an accessory to murder. She served 3 years before being released on parole. She returned to California, where she now works with organizations that help victims of domestic violence, using her experience to help other women recognize and escape abusive relationships. Carol Reeves, Janet's sister who had kept the secret for decades, struggled with guilt over her silence but eventually found peace through counseling and community service. She established a scholarship fund in Maggie Sullivan's memory, providing financial assistance to students who want to become teachers. Detective Crawford was promoted to sergeant partly based on his work on the Sullivan case. He has become a specialist in cold case investigations and frequently speaks at law enforcement conferences about the importance of never giving up on unsolved crimes. The case also had a significant impact on how police departments handle long-term investigations. Crawford's methodical approach to building the case, his careful verification of witness testimony, and his patience in gathering evidence have become a model for other cold case investigators. In the months following Brian Mitchell's conviction, the community of Millbrook came together to properly honor Maggie Sullivan's memory. The high school established the Margaret Sullivan Memorial Library, and the town council voted to rename Elm Street, where Maggie had lived and died, as Sullivan Street. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from her former students. In the 40 years since her death, many of Maggie's students had gone on to become teachers themselves, carrying forward her passion for education and her belief in the potential of every student. One of those students, Tommy Brennan, who had been one of the last people to see Maggie alive during that final tutoring session, had become a high school principal in Pittsburgh. When he learned of Brian Mitchell's arrest, he organized a reunion of Maggie's former students to share memories and celebrate her life. "She saw something in each of us that we didn't see in ourselves," Tommy said at the reunion. She believed we could be more than we thought possible. That's the gift she gave us, and that's the gift we've tried to pass on to our own students." The reunion was attended by dozens of Maggie's former students, including several who had traveled from across the country. They shared stories of her influence on their lives, her encouragement during difficult times, and the lessons she had taught them about perseverance, kindness, and the importance of education. Many spoke about how Maggie's murder had affected them over the years, the sense of lost innocence, the fear that had gripped their community, and the frustration of knowing that her killer had never been brought to justice. But they also spoke about how finally learning the truth had provided a sense of closure that they hadn't realized they needed. "We can finally remember her properly now," said Lisa Martinez, another of Maggie's last students. "For 40 years, her story has been about her death. Now we can focus on her life and all the good she did in the world." As I reach the end of this story, I'm struck by the many lessons it teaches us about truth, justice, and the complex web of choices that shape our lives. Angela Morrison's decision to remain silent for 40 years is understandable but tragic. She was a traumatized teenager who witnessed something that would have challenged even an adult's ability to cope. Her silence protected her in the short term but poisoned her life in ways that lasted for decades. Yet her final decision to speak the truth, even when she had nothing left to lose, showed remarkable courage. In her final months of life, she found the strength to do what she should have done 40 years earlier, and in doing so, she gave Maggie Sullivan's family the gift of justice and gave herself the gift of redemption. Janet Reeves' story is similarly complex. Her loyalty to an abusive boyfriend led her to become an accessory to murder, but her eventual cooperation with authorities helped ensure that justice was finally served. Her work with domestic violence victims shows that people can change, that guilt can be transformed into positive action. Even Carol Reeves, who kept her sister's secret for decades, eventually found a way to honor Maggie's memory through her scholarship fund. Sometimes the path to doing the right thing is longer and more complicated than we would like, but it's never too late to start. Brian Mitchell's story is darker but equally instructive. His crime was born of entitlement, resentment, and the inability to take responsibility for his own failures. He blamed Maggie Sullivan for his problems when the real issue was his own character. His 40 years of freedom while living a lie show how charm and social status can mask evil, but they also show that justice, while sometimes slow, can still arrive. The investigators who worked this case, from Detective Kowalski in the 1980s to Detective Crawford in 2023, demonstrated the importance of persistence and careful police work. They show us that every case matters, that every victim deserves justice, and that good police work combined with advancing technology can solve even the coldest cases. But perhaps the most important lesson of this story is about the corrosive power of secrets and the healing power of truth. Angela Morrison carried the weight of what she had witnessed for 40 years, and it nearly destroyed her life. When she finally found the courage to speak, she not only helped solve a murder but also freed herself from a burden that had defined her existence. The community of Millbrook, too, was healed by learning the truth. For 40 years, they had lived with the fear that a killer was among them, not knowing that their fears were justified. The resolution of the case allowed them to properly grieve for Maggie Sullivan and to celebrate her life rather than just mourn her death. Maggie Sullivan was 34 years old when she died, a teacher who believed in the power of education to transform lives. She never got to see the full impact of her work, never got to witness the success of the hundreds of students she had taught and inspired. But her legacy lived on in ways that even she might not have imagined. The students she taught became teachers, doctors, engineers, parents, and community leaders. They carried her lessons with them, not just about literature and writing, but about kindness, perseverance, and the importance of believing in others. In classrooms across the country, former students of Maggie Sullivan were passing on the same encouragement and support that she had given them. Detective Crawford often reflects on the case and what it taught him about the nature of justice. Sometimes we think of justice as something that happens quickly: the crime is committed, the investigation occurs, the arrest is made, the trial takes place, he says. But real justice is more complicated than that. Sometimes it takes 40 years. Sometimes it requires people to find courage they didn't know they had. Sometimes it means confronting truths that are painful but necessary. The Margaret Sullivan case file, once thick with unanswered questions and false leads, now sits in the closed case archives. But Detective Crawford keeps a photo of Maggie on his desk, the same photo that Detective Kowalski had kept decades earlier. It serves as a reminder that every victim matters, that every case deserves the full attention of law enforcement, and that it's never too late for the truth to emerge. Angela Morrison's final resting place is in a quiet cemetery in Phoenix, far from the Pennsylvania town where her trauma began. But her courage in those final months of her life had an impact that rippled far beyond what she could have imagined. Her decision to speak the truth not only solved a murder but also inspired other witnesses in other cases to come forward with information they had been keeping secret. The Millbrook Police Department now has a protocol for following up on old cases, partly inspired by Angela's late-night phone call. They regularly reach out to potential witnesses in unsolved cases, letting them know that it's never too late to provide information and that there are resources available to help people cope with the trauma of what they may have witnessed. Brian Mitchell remains in the state penitentiary, where he is serving his life sentence. Reports from prison staff suggest that he has struggled to adapt to incarceration and that he continues to maintain his innocence to some fellow inmates, despite his courtroom confession. But there are also reports that he has participated in some prison programs and has expressed genuine remorse to prison counselors. Whether his remorse is genuine or simply another manipulation is something that only Brian himself can answer. What matters more is that he can no longer hurt anyone else and that Maggie Sullivan's family finally has the justice they waited 4 decades to receive. The case has been featured in several true crime documentaries and podcasts, bringing Maggie's story to a national audience. But those who knew her best hope that people will remember her not just as a murder victim, but as a dedicated teacher who made a difference in the lives of countless students. The Margaret Sullivan Memorial Library at Millbrook High School contains not just books, but also a collection of letters and testimonials from her former students. Reading through them, you get a sense of the woman she was, patient with struggling students, demanding of those who weren't working to their potential, always willing to stay late to provide extra help, always believing that education could open doors and change lives. One letter, written by a student who had graduated just months before Maggie's death, captures her essence perfectly. Ms. Sullivan saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. I was a kid from the wrong side of town with no money and no confidence, but she convinced me that I could go to college, that I could make something of my life. She helped me with my applications, wrote recommendation letters, and even helped me find financial aid. I'm now a teacher myself, and every day I try to be the kind of teacher she was, someone who sees potential in every student and never gives up on anyone. This, perhaps, is Maggie Sullivan's true legacy. Not the circumstances of her death, but the impact of her life. Not the violence that ended her story, but the love and dedication that defined it. The case reminds us that justice is not always swift, but it can still be sure. It shows us that secrets have a way of emerging, that guilt has a way of demanding payment, and that the truth, no matter how long buried, has a power that time cannot diminish. Most importantly, it reminds us that every person matters, that every life has value, and that when someone is taken from us through violence, we owe it to them and to ourselves to never stop seeking answers, never stop demanding justice, and never stop remembering the good they brought to the world. Tonight, as you think about this story, remember not just the mystery that was solved or the justice that was finally served. Remember Maggie Sullivan, the teacher who believed in her students, the woman who opened her home to those who needed help, the person whose kindness and dedication made the world a little bit better. Remember Angela Morrison, the traumatized teenager who became a haunted adult but found the courage, in her final months, to do the right thing. Remember all the investigators who worked this case over 4 decades, who never gave up, who kept asking questions and following leads even when it seemed hopeless. And remember that in a world that often seems filled with darkness, there are still people working to bring light, teachers like Maggie, investigators like Detective Crawford, and ordinary citizens who find extraordinary courage when it matters most. The story of Maggie Sullivan's murder is over, but the story of her impact continues. In every classroom where a teacher refuses to give up on a struggling student, in every investigation where a detective pursues justice no matter how long it takes, in every moment when someone chooses to speak the truth despite their fear, Maggie's legacy lives on. That, ultimately, is the most important truth of all. To my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me, thank you for your continued support. I'm grateful for each and every one of you. If you're enjoying the content, please consider sharing it with others who might appreciate it too. And to those who haven't subscribed yet, I'd love for you to join our community, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. And please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Tonight, we travel to the quiet suburbs of Portland, Oregon, where justice sometimes arrives not with sirens and flashing lights, but with the gentle hum of laboratory equipment and the patient work of scientists who speak the language of DNA. This is the story of how a 42-year-old cold case was finally solved, bringing closure to a family that never stopped believing in the power of truth. On a rainy November evening in 1981, 23-year-old Rebecca Turner was found murdered in her small apartment near Reed College. For 4 decades, her killer remained a mystery, hidden in the shadows of time. But science, patience, and the relentless dedication of investigators would eventually illuminate the darkness. This is the story of how Rebecca Turner's voice, silenced for over 40 years, finally spoke through the microscopic evidence she left behind. It's a tale of cutting-edge forensic technology, painstaking detective work, and the profound moment when a family's long wait for answers finally came to an end. Sometimes justice moves slowly, like water wearing away stone. But it moves nonetheless, carrying with it the hopes of those who refuse to forget, and the promise that even the oldest secrets can be revealed. The autumn of 1981 was a time of transition in America. MTV had just launched, Ronald Reagan was settling into his presidency, and personal computers were beginning to appear in homes across the country. In Portland, Oregon, the city was experiencing its own transformation, with young professionals and college students flocking to neighborhoods like Selwood and Hawthorne. Rebecca Turner was part of this new generation. She had moved to Portland from small-town Idaho after graduating from college with a degree in social work. She was bright, ambitious, and deeply committed to helping others. She worked at a community center near downtown, providing services to families in need. Rebecca lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on Southeast Division Street, in a building that housed several other young professionals. Her neighbors described her as friendly but private, someone who kept regular hours and took evening walks around the neighborhood. She had a close relationship with her parents back in Idaho and called them every Sunday without fail. On the evening of November 15, 1981, Rebecca had planned a quiet night at home. She'd stopped at the local grocery store after work, purchasing ingredients for dinner and a bottle of wine. The cashier, who knew Rebecca as a regular customer, later told police that she seemed in good spirits, chatting about her plans for the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. Rebecca's apartment was on the second floor of a well-maintained building. She had lived there for 18 months and had never reported any problems with neighbors or strangers. The building had a secure entry system, though it was not as sophisticated as modern security measures. That Sunday evening, Rebecca spoke with her parents as usual. Her mother, Dorothy Turner, would later recall that Rebecca sounded happy and was looking forward to coming home for Thanksgiving. They talked about family news, Rebecca's work, and her plans to visit her college roommate in Seattle the following month. It was the last conversation Dorothy Turner would ever have with her daughter. The next morning, when Rebecca failed to appear for work, her supervisor became concerned. Rebecca was reliable, never missing work without calling ahead. When repeated phone calls to her apartment went unanswered, Rebecca's supervisor contacted the building manager. What they found in Rebecca's apartment would haunt everyone involved for decades to come. The building manager, accompanied by Rebecca's supervisor, used a master key to enter the apartment at approximately 11:30 a.m. on November 16. What they discovered was a scene that would forever change the lives of everyone who knew Rebecca Turner. Rebecca had been murdered in her living room. The evidence suggested that she had put up a fight, but her attacker had ultimately overpowered her. The apartment showed signs of a struggle, with furniture overturned and personal items scattered across the floor. Detective Robert Chen of the Portland Police Bureau was assigned to lead the investigation. Detective Chen was a 15-year veteran of the force, known for his methodical approach and attention to detail. He arrived at the scene within an hour of the initial call and immediately began documenting everything. The scene told a story, Detective Chen would later recall. Rebecca had been preparing dinner when someone entered her apartment. There were signs that she knew her attacker, or at least had let them in willingly. The door showed no signs of forced entry. The initial investigation revealed several crucial pieces of evidence. DNA technology was still in its infancy in 1981, but Detective Chen made sure that all biological evidence was carefully collected and preserved. Hair fibers, blood samples, and other trace evidence were catalogued and stored according to the best practices of the time. Fingerprints were found throughout the apartment, but the majority belonged to Rebecca herself or to friends and family members who had visited. Several unknown prints were discovered, but without a suspect to compare them to, they provided limited immediate value. The investigation quickly focused on Rebecca's personal relationships. She had been dating occasionally but wasn't in a serious relationship at the time of her death. Her ex-boyfriend from college, who lived in Seattle, had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. Her co-workers, friends, and neighbors were all interviewed extensively. One potential lead emerged from interviews with neighbors. Several residents reported seeing an unfamiliar man in the building's hallway on the evening of November 15. The descriptions were vague and sometimes contradictory, but they generally described a white male in his 20s or 30s with dark hair. The investigation expanded to include known criminals in the area, sex offenders, and anyone with a history of violence against women. Dozens of suspects were interviewed, but none could be definitively linked to the crime. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to slow. Detective Chen continued to follow up on leads and tips, but the case gradually became what law enforcement calls a cold case, unsolved, but not forgotten. For Rebecca Turner's family, the years following her murder were marked by a peculiar kind of grief, the pain of loss compounded by the absence of closure. Her parents, Dorothy and James Turner, became advocates for victims' rights, working with other families who had lost loved ones to unsolved crimes. Detective Chen retired from the Portland Police Bureau in 2001, but he never forgot Rebecca's case. He had worked hundreds of investigations during his career, but Rebecca's murder remained one of the few that truly haunted him. Even in retirement, he would occasionally review the case file, hoping that fresh eyes might reveal something he had missed. Every few years, advances in forensic technology would prompt a re-examination of the evidence. In the 1990s, DNA testing became more sophisticated, and the biological evidence from Rebecca's apartment was analyzed using new techniques. The results confirmed the presence of an unknown male's DNA at the crime scene, but without a suspect to compare it to, the case remained unsolved. The evidence was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, in the hope that it might match with a known offender. For years, the database searches came back negative. Rebecca's killer had either never been arrested for another crime, or had managed to avoid leaving his DNA in the system. Dorothy Turner never stopped believing that her daughter's killer would eventually be caught. She maintained a relationship with the Portland Police Bureau, checking in periodically for updates on the case. She also worked with other cold case families, providing support and sharing resources. "I knew that someday, science would catch up to whoever did this," Dorothy would later say. "I just had to be patient and trust that Rebecca's story wasn't over." The Turner family established a small scholarship fund in Rebecca's name, supporting students studying social work. They held annual memorial services, keeping Rebecca's memory alive in their community. Friends and co-workers who had known Rebecca contributed to the fund and attended the services, ensuring that she would not be forgotten. Meanwhile, advances in DNA technology continued to accelerate. What had once required large samples and weeks of analysis could now be accomplished with microscopic amounts of biological material in a matter of days. The field of genetic genealogy was beginning to emerge, offering new possibilities for solving cold cases. By 2018, the success of genetic genealogy in solving high-profile cases like the Golden State Killer had captured public attention. Police departments across the country began to re-examine their cold cases, wondering if this new technology might provide the breakthrough they had been waiting for. In January 2023, Detective Maria Santos of the Portland Police Bureau's Cold Case Unit received approval to submit Rebecca Turner's case to the Oregon State Police Forensic Services Division for genetic genealogy analysis. Detective Santos had been working cold cases for 5 years and had seen firsthand how genetic genealogy could breathe new life into decades-old investigations. The process began with extracting DNA from the preserved evidence and creating a genetic profile that could be compared to public genealogy databases. This wasn't a simple database search like Cody's, it required building family trees and tracing genetic relationships across multiple generations. The work was assigned to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic genealogist who had helped solve dozens of cold cases across the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Walsh approached each case like a puzzle, using genetic matches to build family trees and identify potential suspects. The Turner case was challenging because the DNA sample was degraded after 40 years of storage, Dr. Walsh explained. But we were able to extract enough genetic information to begin building a profile. The first step was uploading the DNA profile to public genealogy databases and searching for genetic matches. The process identified several distant relatives of the unknown suspect, but none close enough to provide an immediate identification. Dr. Walsh spent weeks building family trees for each genetic match, tracing lineages back through multiple generations. She worked with birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and census data to map out the relationships between the genetic matches and identify potential suspects. The breakthrough came in March 2023, when Dr. Walsh identified a cluster of genetic matches that all traced back to a common ancestor in the early 1900s. By carefully analyzing the family trees, she was able to identify a potential suspect, Thomas Bradley, a 64-year-old man living in Vancouver, Washington. Thomas Bradley had been 22 years old in 1981 and had lived in Portland at the time of Rebecca's murder. He had no significant criminal record, which explained why his DNA had never appeared in Cody's. He had worked various jobs over the years, married and divorced twice, and had moved to Washington State in the 1990s. But the genetic genealogy analysis suggested that Thomas Bradley was the source of the unknown DNA found at Rebecca Turner's crime scene. Detective Santos began the delicate process of building a case against Bradley. The genetic genealogy provided a strong lead, but it wasn't enough for an arrest. The investigation would need to be corroborated with additional evidence. Detective Santos knew that genetic genealogy, while powerful, was just the beginning of building a case against Thomas Bradley. The DNA evidence would need to be confirmed through direct comparison, and investigators would need to establish a connection between Bradley and Rebecca Turner. The first step was obtaining a sample of Bradley's DNA for direct comparison. Detective Santos worked with the Vancouver Police Department to conduct surveillance of Bradley, waiting for an opportunity to collect a discarded sample, a coffee cup, cigarette butt, or other item that might contain his DNA. The opportunity came in April 2023, when Bradley was observed throwing away a coffee cup after leaving a restaurant. The cup was carefully collected and sent to the lab for analysis. Within a week, the results confirmed what the genetic genealogy had suggested: Thomas Bradley was the source of the unknown DNA found at Rebecca Turner's crime scene. With the DNA match confirmed, Detective Santos began investigating Bradley's background more thoroughly. She discovered that in 1981, Bradley had worked as a maintenance worker for a property management company that managed several apartment buildings in southeast Portland, including the building where Rebecca Turner lived. This revelation provided the crucial connection between Bradley and the victim. As a maintenance worker, Bradley would have had access to the building and might have encountered Rebecca in the course of his work. He would have been familiar with the layout of the apartments and the security measures in place. Further investigation revealed that Bradley had been fired from his job in December 1981, just a month after Rebecca's murder. The termination was for performance issues, but Detective Santos wondered if it might have been related to the increased police presence in the building during the investigation. Detective Santos also discovered that Bradley had a history of drinking problems and had been arrested several times for public intoxication and disorderly conduct in the 1980s. While these weren't violent crimes, they suggested a pattern of poor judgment and impulse control that might have contributed to the attack on Rebecca. The investigation team reviewed the original witness statements from 1981, looking for any mention of Bradley or anyone matching his description. One neighbor's statement described seeing a maintenance worker in the hallway on the evening of November 15, but the witness hadn't thought much of it at the time since maintenance workers were a common sight in the building. By May 2023, Detective Santos felt confident that she had enough evidence to make an arrest. The DNA match, combined with Bradley's access to the building and his presence in the area at the time of the murder, provided a compelling case for prosecution. On the morning of May 23, 2023, Detective Santos and a team of officers from the Vancouver Police Department arrived at Thomas Bradley's modest home in a quiet residential neighborhood. Bradley was working in his garden when the police arrived, tending to tomato plants in the early morning sunlight. "Thomas Bradley?" Detective Santos asked as she approached the garden gate. "Yeah, that's me," Bradley replied, straightening up from his work. "Is there a problem?" "I'm Detective Santos with the Portland Police Bureau. I need to speak with you about an incident that occurred in Portland in 1981. The color drained from Bradley's face. After 42 years, the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. Bradley was read his rights and transported to the Vancouver Police Department for questioning. The interview room was small and windowless, with recording equipment capturing every word. Detective Santos had conducted hundreds of interviews, but this one felt different. This was the culmination of decades of work by multiple investigators, scientists, and forensic experts. Initially, Bradley denied any involvement in Rebecca Turner's murder. He claimed he didn't remember her and insisted that any DNA evidence must have been the result of contamination or error. But as Detective Santos presented the evidence, the genetic genealogy analysis, the DNA match, his employment records, and his access to the building, Bradley's denials became less convincing. "Thomas, we know you were in that building on November 15, 1981, Detective Santos said calmly. "We know you had access to Rebecca's apartment. We know your DNA was found at the crime scene. What we don't know is why. Help us understand what happened." Bradley remained silent for long minutes, staring at his hands. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "I was drinking a lot back then," he said quietly. "I had problems. I was angry all the time. I saw her around the building, and I don't know why I did it. I was drunk and stupid and God, I've regretted it every day since." The confession continued for over an hour, with Bradley providing details about the crime that had never been released to the public. He described entering Rebecca's apartment under the pretense of checking a maintenance issue, then attacking her when she became suspicious of his behavior. "I never meant for it to happen," Bradley said, tears streaming down his face. "I was just supposed to check the thermostat, but I was drunk and I lost control. I've thought about it every day for 40 years. I knew someone would come for me eventually." Thomas Bradley's confession provided the missing pieces of the puzzle that had frustrated investigators for over 4 decades. His account of the events of November 15, 1981, matched the physical evidence found at the crime scene and answered many of the questions that had lingered since Rebecca's murder. According to Bradley's confession, he had been drinking heavily on the evening of November 15 after receiving a warning from his supervisor about his job performance. He had been struggling with alcohol abuse and was facing the possibility of termination from his job with the property management company. Bradley had decided to enter Rebecca's apartment under the pretense of checking a thermostat issue that had been reported by another tenant. He had keys to all the apartments in the building and frequently entered units to perform maintenance tasks. Rebecca had let him in, assuming he was there on legitimate business. She was making dinner, Bradley recalled during his confession. She was nice, asked if I wanted some coffee while I worked. I should have just checked the thermostat and left, but I was drunk and angry and I started looking around her apartment. When Rebecca realized that Bradley wasn't actually there for maintenance work, she became alarmed and asked him to leave. Bradley, intoxicated and already agitated, became aggressive. The situation escalated quickly, leading to the struggle that investigators had reconstructed from the physical evidence. I never meant to kill her, Bradley said repeatedly during his confession. I just wanted to. I don't know what I wanted. I was drunk and stupid and angry. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. After the attack, Bradley had attempted to clean up the scene but had been too intoxicated to do a thorough job. He had left the apartment through the back stairs and had gone home, where he had passed out from the alcohol. The next morning, he claimed, he had only fragmentary memories of what had occurred. Bradley's confession also revealed the psychological toll that the crime had taken on him over the years. He described decades of guilt, nightmares, and substance abuse as he struggled to cope with what he had done. He had moved to Washington State in part to escape the memories associated with Portland, but the guilt had followed him. I knew someone would come for me eventually, Bradley said. I've been waiting for this day for 40 years. Part of me is relieved that it's finally over. When Detective Santos called Dorothy Turner to inform her of the arrest, the now 89-year-old woman was sitting in her kitchen in Boise, Idaho, the same kitchen where she had received the devastating news of her daughter's murder 42 years earlier. Mrs. Turner, this is Detective Santos with the Portland Police Bureau. I'm calling to let you know that we've made an arrest in your daughter Rebecca's case. Dorothy Turner was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, "Thank you. I always knew this day would come." The news of the arrest spread quickly through the Turner family and the community that had never forgotten Rebecca. Her brother Michael, now 67 and living in Colorado, had maintained his own investigation into his sister's murder for decades, creating files and following leads that the police had missed. "It's surreal," Michael Turner said when contacted by reporters. "For 40 years, we've wondered who killed Rebecca and why. Now we know. It doesn't bring her back, but it does bring some peace." The arrest also affected the retired investigators who had worked on the case over the years. Detective Robert Chin, now 78 and living in retirement in Eastern Oregon, received a call from Detective Santos informing him of the breakthrough. "I always believed we'd solve this case," Detective Chin said. "DNA technology has given us tools that we never had before. Rebecca Turner's killer may have thought he got away with murder, but science and persistence finally caught up with him." The news of the arrest was covered extensively by local media, with reporters interviewing neighbors, co-workers, and friends who had known Rebecca. Many of them expressed relief that the case had finally been solved, but also sadness that it had taken so long. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic genealogist who had identified Bradley through genetic analysis, reflected on the significance of the case. "This is why we do this work," she said. "Every cold case represents a family that has been waiting for answers, sometimes for decades. When we can provide those answers, it's incredibly meaningful." The arrest also highlighted the growing importance of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases. The Turner case was one of dozens of similar cases that had been solved using the technique, demonstrating the power of combining modern science with traditional investigative methods. For Dorothy Turner, the arrest brought a mixture of emotions, relief, sadness, and a sense of justice finally being served. "I'm glad he's been caught," she said. "But I'm also sad that it took so long. Rebecca would be 65 years old now. She never got to have a family, a career, grandchildren. That's the real tragedy." Thomas Bradley was formally charged with second-degree murder in the death of Rebecca Turner on May 25, 2023. The case was assigned to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, which had extensive experience prosecuting cold cases solved through genetic genealogy. Deputy District Attorney Sarah Chen, no relation to the original investigating detective, was assigned to prosecute the case. She had worked on several high-profile cold cases and understood the unique challenges of prosecuting crimes that occurred decades earlier. The primary challenge facing the prosecution was the passage of time. Many of the original witnesses had died or could no longer be located. The crime scene had been processed using 1981 technology, which meant that some evidence had been lost or degraded over the years. The prosecution would need to rely heavily on the DNA evidence and Bradley's confession. Bradley's defense attorney, appointed by the court, argued that his client's confession had been coerced and that the DNA evidence was unreliable due to the passage of time. He also contended that Bradley's alcohol abuse in 1981 had impaired his ability to form the intent necessary for a murder conviction. The case never went to trial. In September 2023, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy trial, Bradley agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. At his age of 64, this was effectively a life sentence. The plea hearing was held in a packed courtroom, with members of the Turner family, retired investigators, and members of the community in attendance. Bradley, now gray-haired and wearing an orange jail jumpsuit, stood before the judge and formally entered his guilty plea. "Do you understand that by pleading guilty, you are admitting that you caused the death of Rebecca Turner on November 15, 1981, the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Bradley replied quietly. The judge also allowed victim impact statements from the Turner family. Dorothy Turner, now frail but determined, read a statement she had prepared about her daughter's life and the impact of her death on the family. "Rebecca was a bright, loving young woman with her whole life ahead of her," Dorothy read. "She wanted to help people, to make the world a better place. Thomas Bradley robbed her of that opportunity and robbed our family of 40 years with our daughter. No sentence can bring Rebecca back, but at least justice has finally been served." Michael Turner also spoke, describing the decades of wondering and waiting that the family had endured. "We never stopped believing that Rebecca's killer would be caught," he said. "Today, that belief has been vindicated." Bradley was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. He spoke briefly, apologizing to the Turner family and expressing remorse for his actions. "I know that nothing I can say will bring Rebecca back or undo the pain I've caused," Bradley said. "I've carried the guilt of what I did for 40 years, and I'll carry it for the rest of my life. I'm sorry." The sentencing of Thomas Bradley marked the end of one of the longest-running cold cases in Portland's history. After 42 years, Rebecca Turner's family finally had the answers they had been seeking, and her killer was behind bars. The case had a profound impact on the law enforcement community, demonstrating the power of genetic genealogy to solve even the oldest cold cases. The Portland Police Bureau's Cold Case Unit received additional funding to apply genetic genealogy techniques to other unsolved crimes, leading to several additional arrests in the following months. Detective Santos, who had worked tirelessly to solve Rebecca's case, reflected on the significance of the conviction. "This case shows that we never give up on victims," she said. "Even when years or decades pass, we continue to work these cases. Science gives us new tools, but the commitment to justice remains constant." The Turner family established a foundation in Rebecca's memory, focusing on supporting victims' families and funding research into cold case investigation techniques. Dorothy Turner, despite her advanced age, became an advocate for other families dealing with unsolved crimes. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic genealogist who identified Bradley, continued her work on other cold cases. The Turner case became a model for how genetic genealogy could be applied to solve decades-old crimes, and her techniques were adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country. The case also highlighted the importance of evidence preservation. The DNA evidence that ultimately solved Rebecca's case had been carefully stored for over 40 years, demonstrating the foresight of the original investigators who understood that future technology might provide new solutions to old problems. For the Portland community, the resolution of Rebecca's case provided a sense of closure. The young social worker who had been brutally murdered in 1981 was finally at peace, and her killer was facing justice. The building where Rebecca lived was still standing as of 2023, though it had been renovated several times over the years. A small memorial plaque was placed near the entrance, commemorating Rebecca's life and service to the community. Thomas Bradley was transported to Oregon State Penitentiary to begin serving his sentence. At 64 years old and in poor health, he was unlikely to ever be released. The man who had evaded justice for over 4 decades would spend his remaining years behind bars, finally paying for the crime he had committed as a young man. The case served as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, is not always denied. Through the persistence of investigators, the advancement of science, and the determination of families who refuse to give up, even the oldest secrets can be brought to light. The resolution of Rebecca Turner's case had ripple effects that extended far beyond the courtroom. It became a catalyst for changes in how law enforcement approaches cold cases and highlighted the growing importance of genetic genealogy in solving crimes. The Turner case was featured in several forensic science journals and was used as a teaching example in criminal justice programs across the country. It demonstrated the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation between traditional investigators and genetic genealogists, showing how old-fashioned detective work could be enhanced by cutting-edge science. The case also sparked discussions about the ethics of genetic genealogy and the privacy implications of using public DNA databases to solve crimes. While most people supported the use of these techniques to solve serious crimes, there were concerns about potential misuse and the need for proper oversight. Dr. Walsh and other genetic genealogists worked with law enforcement agencies to develop best practices for the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. These guidelines ensured that the technique would be used responsibly and ethically, with appropriate safeguards to protect individual privacy. For the Turner family, the resolution of Rebecca's case brought not just closure, but also a sense of purpose. Dorothy Turner, despite her advanced age, became a spokesperson for other families dealing with cold cases. She traveled to conferences, spoke at victims' rights events, and provided support to other families enduring similar ordeals. Rebecca's story didn't end when she died, Dorothy explained. It continued through all the people who worked to find her killer, and it continues now through the families we're able to help. The Rebecca Turner Cold Case Foundation, established by the family, provided grants to law enforcement agencies for genetic genealogy research and offered support services to families of cold case victims. The foundation also funded scholarships for students studying forensic science and criminal justice. The Portland Police Bureau's Cold Case Unit, energized by the success of the Turner case, applied genetic genealogy techniques to dozens of other unsolved crimes. Several additional cases were solved in the months following Bradley's conviction, bringing closure to other families who had been waiting for answers. Detective Santos, promoted to sergeant in recognition of her work on the Turner case, continued to lead the cold case unit. She mentored younger investigators in the use of genetic genealogy and traditional investigative techniques, ensuring that the lessons learned from Rebecca's case would be passed on to future generations of investigators. The Turner case also influenced legislation regarding the preservation of evidence and the funding of cold case investigations. Several states passed laws requiring the long-term preservation of biological evidence from serious crimes, ensuring that future advances in forensic technology could be applied to solve cold cases. The story of Rebecca Turner and the decades-long quest for justice served as inspiration for other families dealing with unsolved crimes. It proved that persistence, combined with advancing technology, could overcome even the most challenging obstacles to justice. As we conclude this story of justice delayed but not denied, we remember that behind every cold case is a human being whose life was cut short, and a family that never stopped believing in the possibility of answers. Rebecca Turner was more than just a victim of a brutal crime. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a dedicated social worker who had devoted her life to helping others. Her murder robbed the world of the contributions she might have made, the lives she might have touched, and the family she might have raised. But Rebecca's story also demonstrates the power of human determination and scientific advancement. For 42 years, investigators refused to give up on her case. Scientists developed new techniques that could extract information from the smallest traces of evidence. Family members maintained hope even when hope seemed futile. The resolution of Rebecca's case reminds us that justice is not just about punishment, but about truth, closure, and the affirmation that every life has value. When Thomas Bradley was finally brought to justice, it wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral victory for everyone who believes that the innocent deserve protection and the guilty deserve accountability. The story of Rebecca Turner and the genetic genealogy breakthrough that solved her case is part of a larger revolution in forensic science. As DNA technology continues to advance, more cold cases are being solved, more families are finding closure, and more criminals are being held accountable for their actions. But technology alone doesn't solve crimes, people do. Dedicated investigators, skilled scientists, and determined family members working together can accomplish what seemed impossible just a few years ago. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Rebecca Turner, not just as a victim of a terrible crime, but as a young woman who made a difference in her community, whose memory inspired decades of dedicated work by countless individuals, and whose story ultimately became a testament to the power of persistence and the promise that truth will eventually prevail. In the end, Rebecca Turner's voice was heard. Justice was served. And her legacy lives on through the foundation that bears her name, the investigators who continue to seek justice for other victims, and the families who never stop believing that answers are possible. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 3. This story takes us to the quiet mountains of western North Carolina, where morning mist clings to ancient peaks and hiking trails wind through forests that have witnessed countless stories. This is the case of Amanda Richardson, a 28-year-old software engineer from Charlotte, whose disappearance on a crisp October morning in 2023 would baffle investigators and leave a community searching for answers. Sometimes the most profound mysteries begin with the simplest of intentions. Amanda had planned what should have been a routine solo hike along the Blue Ridge Parkway. She was an experienced outdoors woman, someone who found solace in the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath her boots and the gentle whisper of wind through pine branches. But on October 14, 2023, Amanda Richardson stepped onto the Rough Ridge Trail near Grandfather Mountain and seemingly vanished into the Carolina wilderness, leaving behind only questions and a digital breadcrumb trail that would captivate investigators for months to come. The morning of October 14 dawned crisp and clear in Charlotte. Amanda Richardson's apartment on East Boulevard was bathed in the kind of golden autumn light that makes everything seem possible. Her neighbors would later remember seeing her loading her blue Honda Civic with hiking gear around 6:30 a.m., her movements methodical and purposeful. Amanda worked as a senior software engineer at a financial technology company downtown. She was methodical in everything she did, her code was clean, her documentation thorough, her hiking preparation meticulous. This attention to detail would become crucial to understanding what happened next. Her roommate, Jennifer Walsh, was still asleep when Amanda left. Jennifer would later tell investigators that Amanda had mentioned her plans the night before over takeout Thai food. She was excited about the hike, Jennifer recalled. She'd been talking about Rough Ridge for weeks. Said the views were supposed to be incredible this time of year, with all the fall colors. Amanda had researched the trail extensively. Her browser history, later examined by investigators, revealed visits to hiking forums, weather reports, and detailed trail maps. She'd even checked recent reviews on all trails, noting that other hikers had mentioned some muddy sections near the summit but nothing concerning. The drive from Charlotte to Rough Ridge typically takes about 2 hours. Amanda's phone records show she made the journey without incident, her location pinging cell towers along Highway 221 as she wound her way into the mountains. Her last text message was sent at 8:47 a.m. to her mother, "Almost there. Weather perfect. We'll call tonight. Love you." At 9:15 a.m., Amanda pulled into the Rough Ridge parking area. The trail is popular, but October weekday mornings tend to be quieter. According to the parking lot security camera, a detail that would prove crucial, only 4 other vehicles were present when Amanda arrived. What makes Amanda's case particularly puzzling is the digital trail she left behind. In our modern age, we rarely disappear without trace. Our phones, our apps, our social media accounts, they all leave breadcrumbs. Amanda's digital footprint would become the most important evidence in her case. Amanda was an avid user of fitness tracking apps. Her Garmin watch, synced to her iPhone, had been recording her hiking activities for 3 years. She typically documented her adventures with photos and detailed notes about trail conditions, wildlife sightings, and personal reflections. This digital diary would provide investigators with unprecedented insight into her final hours. At 9:23 a.m., Amanda's Garmin recorded the beginning of her hike. The Rough Ridge Trail is a 1.4-mile loop that's considered moderate difficulty. The elevation gain is about 400 feet, and on a clear day, the views from the summit are spectacular, rolling mountains stretching to the horizon, a patchwork of autumn colors in October. Amanda's pace was consistent with her usual hiking rhythm. Her heart rate remained in the normal range for moderate exercise. The GPS track showed she followed the main trail without deviation, stopping occasionally, presumably to take photos or simply enjoy the scenery. At 10:15 a.m., Amanda's fitness tracker showed her reaching the summit. She spent approximately 12 minutes at the top, her heart rate dropping to resting levels. This was typical behavior for Amanda. She often took extended breaks to appreciate views and take photographs. But here's where things become strange. At 10:27 a.m., Amanda began her descent. The GPS track shows her leaving the summit area and heading back down the trail. For the next 18 minutes, everything appeared normal. Her pace was slightly faster going downhill, her route followed the established trail markers. Then, at 10:45 a.m., Amanda's digital presence simply stopped. Her Garmin watch stopped recording. Her iPhone stopped pinging cell towers. Her fitness app ceased collecting data. It was as if she had suddenly stepped out of the digital world entirely. When Amanda failed to return home by Sunday evening, Jennifer Walsh began to worry. Amanda was punctual, reliable. She always called when she said she would. By Monday morning, when Amanda didn't show up for work, Jennifer contacted the police. The initial response was measured. "Adults have the right to disappear," officers explained. Perhaps Amanda had decided to extend her trip. Perhaps she'd met someone. Perhaps she simply needed time away. But Jennifer knew her roommate. This wasn't like Amanda at all. Detective Sarah Chen of the Avery County Sheriff's Office was assigned to the case. Chen had been investigating missing persons cases in the North Carolina mountains for 8 years. She'd seen hikers get lost, injured, or simply overwhelmed by the wilderness. But Amanda's case felt different from the beginning. The digital cutoff was the first red flag, Detective Chen would later explain. "In my experience, when someone's tracking devices stop working simultaneously, it's usually not an accident. Either there was a technical malfunction, or someone deliberately disabled the devices." The formal search began on Tuesday, October 17th. The Avery County Search and Rescue Team, along with volunteers from the local hiking community, combed the Rough Ridge area. They followed Amanda's documented GPS track, paying special attention to the point where her digital signal vanished. The search area was challenging. The trail winds through dense forest, with several steep drop-offs and rocky outcroppings. Fall leaves covered the ground, making it difficult to spot any traces of Amanda's passage. The recent rain had also washed away any potential footprints or disturbed vegetation. Search teams used a grid pattern, covering every square meter of the forest around the trail. They brought in tracking dogs, hoping to pick up Amanda's scent. The dogs showed interest in several areas but were unable to establish a clear trail leading away from the main path. Drone operators flew over the area, their cameras scanning the forest canopy for any sign of Amanda or her distinctive teal hiking jacket. The aerial footage revealed the vast scope of the wilderness surrounding the trail, hundreds of acres of dense forest, deep ravines, and rocky terrain where someone could easily become lost or injured. By the end of the first week, over 200 volunteers had participated in the search effort. Local news stations picked up the story. Amanda's photo, a smiling woman with shoulder-length brown hair and kind eyes, appeared on missing person flyers throughout the region. But there was no trace of Amanda Richardson. As the search efforts continued, Detective Chen began examining Amanda's life for any clues that might explain her disappearance. What she found was a woman who seemed to have everything together: a successful career, close relationships, and a passion for outdoor activities. Amanda had grown up in Asheville, about an hour from Rough Ridge. Her parents, both teachers, had instilled in her a love of nature and education. She'd earned a computer science degree from NC State and had been working in Charlotte for 6 years. Colleagues described her as dedicated, creative, and reliable. But everyone has complexities, and Amanda was no exception. Detective Chen learned that Amanda had recently ended a 2-year relationship with her boyfriend, Michael Torres. The breakup had been amicable, according to friends, but Amanda had been working through the emotional aftermath. Michael Torres was cooperative with investigators. He provided phone records, social media accounts, and an alibi for the morning of Amanda's disappearance. He'd been at work in Charlotte, with multiple witnesses confirming his presence. There was no evidence of recent contact between Michael and Amanda, and no indication of any lingering animosity. Amanda's financial records showed no unusual activity. Her credit cards hadn't been used since her last purchase, a coffee and energy bar at a gas station near Blowing Rock on her way to the trail. Her bank accounts remained untouched. The investigation expanded to include Amanda's digital communications. Her email, social media accounts, and text messages were examined for any hint of depression, unusual contacts, or plans to disappear voluntarily. What investigators found was a woman making future plans. She'd recently booked a vacation to Iceland for the following spring and had been researching graduate programs in environmental engineering. This evidence of future-focused thinking made voluntary disappearance seem unlikely. Amanda was building a life, not running from one. Detective Chen also interviewed other hikers who had been on the trail that morning. The parking lot security camera had captured 4 other vehicles, and investigators were able to identify 3 of the 4 owners. There was Robert Kim, a 45-year-old photographer from Asheville who had been capturing fall foliage shots. He remembered seeing a woman matching Amanda's description on the trail but hadn't spoken with her directly. Sarah and Tom Mitchell, a retired couple from Charlotte, had been hiking the trail for exercise. They recalled passing a young woman near the summit area but couldn't be certain it was Amanda. The 4th vehicle remained a mystery. The license plate was partially obscured by mud, and the make and model were difficult to determine from the security footage. This unknown hiker became a person of interest, though investigators had no way to identify them. 3 weeks into the investigation, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local photography enthusiast named David Park had been taking time-lapse photos of the sunrise from an overlook near Rough Ridge on the morning of Amanda's disappearance. David had set up his camera at 5:30 a.m. and let it run until 11 a.m., capturing the changing light as the sun rose over the mountains. When he heard about Amanda's case, he contacted police and offered to share his footage. The time-lapse photos were fascinating from an artistic perspective, but they also provided something invaluable to the investigation: a chronological record of activity in the area. Detective Chen spent hours examining each frame, looking for any human movement or unusual activity. At first, the photos seemed to show only the natural progression of morning light across the landscape. But then, at 10:52 a.m., just 7 minutes after Amanda's digital trail went cold, David's camera captured something interesting. A figure could be seen moving through the forest below the overlook, roughly half a mile from the main trail. The person appeared to be carrying a large backpack and was moving quickly through the trees. The distance and lighting made it impossible to identify the individual, but the timing was significant. Even more intriguing was what appeared to be a second figure, visible in frames captured 11 minutes later. This person was moving in the opposite direction, toward the parking area. Again, the distance made identification impossible, but the figure appeared to be walking rather than hiking, no backpack, no outdoor gear visible. Detective Chen brought in image enhancement specialists to analyze the time-lapse frames. The results were frustrating. The resolution wasn't sufficient to provide clear identification, but the analysis did reveal that the two figures were likely different people, based on their apparent height and build. This evidence suggested that something had happened in the forest between 10:45 a.m. and 11:03 a.m. The timing coincided perfectly with Amanda's digital blackout. But what had occurred during those 18 minutes remained a mystery. The discovery of the time-lapse footage reinvigorated the search effort. Teams focused on the area where the first figure had been spotted, hoping to find evidence of Amanda's presence or signs of what might have happened to her. The North Carolina mountains have always been places of mystery. Cherokee legends speak of spirits that dwell in the deep forests, and even today, experienced hikers report feeling watched when they venture into certain areas. The wilderness around Rough Ridge is particularly dense, with sections that seem to exist in perpetual twilight beneath the canopy of ancient trees. As search teams combed the area where the time-lapse figure had been spotted, they discovered just how challenging the terrain was. The forest floor was covered with fallen logs, dense undergrowth, and rocky outcroppings that created natural hiding places. Visibility was limited to just a few feet in most directions. The searchers did find evidence of recent human activity, footprints in muddy areas, broken branches, and disturbed vegetation. But determining whether these traces were connected to Amanda's disappearance or simply the result of previous hikers was impossible. One discovery, however, stood out. About 200 yards from where the time-lapse figure had been spotted, search teams found a small piece of teal fabric caught on a thorn bush. The fabric matched the color of Amanda's hiking jacket, according to her roommate Jennifer. The fabric was carefully collected and sent for analysis. DNA testing confirmed that the fabric had come from a jacket worn by Amanda. Skin cells and hair follicles were present on the material. This was the first physical evidence of Amanda's presence away from the main trail. But the fabric raised more questions than it answered. How had a piece of Amanda's jacket ended up so far from the trail? Had she wandered off the path and become lost? Had she been chased or pursued? Or had someone else removed the fabric and placed it there? The location of the fabric was particularly puzzling. It was found in an area that would require deliberate navigation to reach, not somewhere a lost hiker would randomly wander. The thorns that caught the fabric were at chest height, suggesting that someone had been moving quickly through the dense undergrowth. Detective Chen began to develop a theory. Perhaps Amanda had encountered someone on the trail, possibly the unknown hiker from the parking lot. Perhaps this encounter had led to a confrontation or chase through the forest. The fabric could have been torn during a struggle or while running through the dense undergrowth. But this theory raised another question: where was Amanda now? If there had been an altercation in the forest, what had happened to her? The extensive search had covered the entire area multiple times, with no trace of Amanda herself. As news of Amanda's disappearance spread throughout North Carolina, the response from the community was overwhelming. Social media groups dedicated to finding Amanda attracted thousands of members. Volunteers organized additional search efforts, fundraising campaigns, and awareness events. Amanda's parents, David and Linda Richardson, became the public face of the search effort. They were dignified in their grief, speaking to news reporters and organizing volunteer efforts while maintaining hope that their daughter would be found alive. "Amanda has always been a fighter," Linda Richardson told reporters. "She's strong, she's smart, and she knows these mountains. We believe she's out there somewhere, and we won't stop looking until we find her." The hiking community, in particular, rallied around Amanda's case. Experienced outdoors enthusiasts volunteered their time and expertise, bringing specialized equipment and knowledge of the local terrain. They organized weekend search parties, created detailed maps of the area, and shared information about the case on social media. Local businesses also joined the effort. Restaurants donated food for search volunteers, outdoor gear companies provided equipment, and hotels offered discounted rates for out-of-town volunteers. The small mountain communities around Rough Ridge demonstrated the best of human nature in their response to tragedy. But as weeks turned into months, the intensity of the search effort began to wane. Professional search teams had to be redeployed to other cases. Volunteer enthusiasm, while still strong, became more sporadic. The harsh reality of a missing person case began to set in. Without new leads or evidence, the investigation could only continue for so long. Detective Chen, however, remained committed to the case. She continued to follow up on tips, re-examine evidence, and interview potential witnesses. She also maintained regular contact with Amanda's family, providing updates and ensuring them that the case remained active. "Missing person investigations are marathons, not sprints," Detective Chen explained. "Sometimes the breakthrough comes months or even years later. We have to be patient and persistent." As the investigation continued, technological experts were brought in to analyze Amanda's devices and digital trail more thoroughly. What they discovered added new layers to the mystery. Amanda's iPhone had been recovered from her apartment. She had left it behind deliberately, something that seemed unusual given her reliance on technology for navigation and communication during hikes. But her Garmin watch, which contained the GPS data, had never been found. Digital forensics experts examined Amanda's phone for any clues about her intentions or state of mind. Her search history showed typical pre-hike research, but one detail stood out: she had been researching how to hike without cell service and analog navigation techniques. This suggested that Amanda had been planning to disconnect from digital technology during her hike, which could explain why she left her phone at home. But it also raised questions about why her Garmin watch had stopped recording if she had intended to continue tracking her route. The experts also discovered that Amanda had been using a lesser-known hiking app called TrailShare, which allowed hikers to share real-time location data with other app users. This app had been running in the background on her Garmin watch, potentially transmitting her location to other hikers in the area. Investigation of the TrailShare data revealed that 3 other users had been active in the Rough Ridge area on the morning of Amanda's disappearance. 2 of these users were identified as the Mitchell couple, who had already been interviewed. The 3rd user remained anonymous, identified only by a username, MountainGhost47. Attempts to contact MountainGhost47 through the app were unsuccessful. The account appeared to have been deleted shortly after Amanda's disappearance. This raised the possibility that someone had been monitoring Amanda's location through the app and might have used this information to track her movements. The TrailShare discovery opened up new avenues of investigation. Detective Chen worked with the app company to gather more information about MountainGhost47, but the user had provided minimal information when creating the account, just a username and a disposable email address. This digital evidence suggested that Amanda's disappearance might not have been a random encounter. Someone might have been deliberately tracking her movements, waiting for the right opportunity to approach her. The timing of the account deletion was particularly suspicious. It suggested awareness of the investigation and an attempt to cover digital tracks. As winter settled over the North Carolina mountains, the search for Amanda Richardson entered a new phase. Snow and ice made the terrain even more challenging, and the harsh weather limited search activities. The investigation became more focused on digital evidence and cold case techniques. Detective Chen used the winter months to re-examine every aspect of the case. She created detailed timelines, analyzed cell phone data, and worked with profilers to develop theories about what might have happened to Amanda. One theory that emerged was that Amanda had been abducted by someone who had been monitoring her activities online. The Trailshare app discovery suggested that her movements had been tracked, and the timing of her disappearance, just as she was beginning her descent, indicated that someone might have been waiting for her. Another possibility was that Amanda had encountered someone on the trail who meant her harm. The unknown vehicle in the parking lot remained unidentified, and despite extensive investigation, no additional witnesses had come forward. The fabric evidence continued to puzzle investigators. Advanced analysis revealed that the tear pattern was consistent with snagging on thorns, but it could also have been consistent with deliberate cutting. The DNA evidence confirmed that Amanda had been wearing the jacket when the fabric was torn, but it couldn't determine whether the tear occurred during a struggle, an attempt to escape, or some other circumstance. Amanda's family remained hopeful throughout the winter months, but the strain was evident. They organized monthly vigils, maintained social media campaigns, and worked with other families of missing persons to raise awareness about the issue. "We've learned that Amanda's case is not unique," David Richardson explained to a support group. "There are hundreds of people who disappear in wilderness areas every year. Some are found, some are not. The not knowing is the hardest part." The National Park Service and other agencies began reviewing their procedures for tracking hikers and responding to missing person reports. Amanda's case had highlighted gaps in the system, the lack of standardized check-in procedures, the difficulty of coordinating searches across multiple jurisdictions, and the challenges of investigating crimes in remote wilderness areas. As spring returned to the mountains in 2024, new search efforts were organized. The melting snow revealed areas that had been inaccessible during the winter, and volunteers were eager to resume their activities. On a warm April morning, almost exactly 6 months after Amanda's disappearance, a team of volunteer searchers made a discovery that would change the investigation completely. In a deep ravine about a mile from the main trail, searchers found Amanda's Garmin watch. It was damaged and partially buried under fallen leaves, but the GPS unit was still intact. The watch had been recording data right up until the moment of its destruction. Digital forensics experts were able to extract the final GPS coordinates from the watch's memory. The data showed that Amanda had indeed left the main trail at 10:45 a.m., just as the time-lapse photos had suggested. But instead of heading toward the parking area, she had moved deeper into the forest. The GPS track showed Amanda moving quickly through the forest for approximately 8 minutes, covering nearly half a mile of difficult terrain. Her path was erratic, suggesting she was either lost or being pursued. Her heart rate data from those final minutes was extremely elevated, indicating extreme stress or physical exertion. The watch's final GPS coordinates placed Amanda at the bottom of a steep ravine, approximately 50 feet below the point where the watch was found. This ravine had been searched multiple times, but the thick vegetation and rocky terrain had made it difficult to examine thoroughly. Renewed search efforts focused on this ravine and the surrounding area. Search teams rappelled into the deepest sections, used ground-penetrating radar to examine suspicious areas, and brought in additional tracking dogs to search for any trace of Amanda. The discovery of the watch raised new questions about Amanda's final moments. Had she fallen into the ravine accidentally? Had she been pushed? Or had she hidden there deliberately to escape from someone? The watch's physical damage was consistent with a fall from a significant height, but forensic analysis couldn't determine whether the fall had been accidental or intentional. The device showed impact damage and had been exposed to the elements for months. As of today, Amanda Richardson remains missing. The discovery of her Garmin watch provided new evidence but not the answers her family desperately seeks. The investigation continues, with Detective Chen following up on new leads and tips that still arrive regularly. The case has had a lasting impact on the hiking community and law enforcement agencies. New protocols have been established for coordinating search efforts, and several hiking apps have improved their safety features in direct response to Amanda's case. The Trailshare app, which played a crucial role in the investigation, has implemented new privacy controls and verification procedures. Users can now choose to share their location only with verified contacts, and the app maintains better records of user activity for law enforcement purposes. Amanda's parents have established a foundation in her name, focused on improving hiker safety and supporting families of missing persons. They continue to organize search efforts and maintain hope that Amanda will be found. "We've accepted that Amanda might not come home," Linda Richardson said recently. "But we haven't accepted that we'll never know what happened to her. The not knowing is what keeps us going." The Rough Ridge Trail remains popular with hikers, but Amanda's case has made many people more aware of the potential dangers of solo hiking. Local hiking groups now encourage buddy system hiking and have established check-in procedures for solo hikers. Detective Chen continues to work the case, though she has been assigned to other investigations as well. She reviews the evidence regularly, hoping that new technology or a fresh perspective might reveal something that was missed. "Missing person cases are never really closed," she explains. "They're just waiting for the right piece of information to break them open." The mountains of North Carolina continue to attract hikers from around the world. The trails wind through ancient forests, past spectacular vistas, and into the heart of wilderness that has remained largely unchanged for centuries. Most hikers return home safely, carrying memories of beauty and solitude. But occasionally, the mountains keep their visitors. Amanda Richardson joined the long list of people who have disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind only questions and the hope that someday, answers will emerge. Her case reminds us that even in our connected, digital age, it's still possible to vanish without a trace. The forest doesn't care about our GPS devices, our cell phones, or our social media presence. It operates by older, more fundamental rules. Perhaps that's what draws us to these wild places, the reminder that we are not in complete control, that mystery and uncertainty still exist in our world. We seek the solitude and beauty of the wilderness, knowing that it comes with risks. Amanda Richardson went to the mountains seeking peace and beauty on that October morning. Instead, she became part of the mystery that surrounds these ancient peaks. Her story continues to unfold, waiting for the day when the forest finally reveals its secrets. Until then, the search continues. The questions remain. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of western North Carolina, the truth waits to be discovered. Story 4. This story is also a different story from our usual mysteries. This is a tale of justice finally served after 40 years of terror, of cutting-edge genetic genealogy solving one of America's most notorious cold cases, and of countless victims who thought they'd never see their attacker brought to justice. We're traveling back to the mid-1970s, to the suburbs of California, where a masked predator began a reign of terror that would span over a decade and claim at least 13 lives. But our story doesn't end in the 1980s when the attack stopped. It continues through 4 decades of investigation, dead ends, and relentless pursuit by law enforcement and amateur sleuths alike, culminating in a shocking arrest in 2018 that stunned the world. This is a story about the evolution of criminal investigation, the power of DNA evidence, and how a discarded piece of trash would finally unmask one of California's most prolific serial killers. So let me take you through the extraordinary case of Joseph James DeAngelo, the man who terrorized California as the Golden State Killer, and how modern science finally brought him to justice. The story begins on June 18, 1976, in Rancho Cordova, California, a quiet suburb of Sacramento. It was a warm summer evening when a masked intruder slipped through an unlocked sliding glass door and forever changed the lives of a young couple. The woman, just 21 years old, was awakened by a flashlight beam and a man's whispered threats. Her boyfriend, sleeping beside her, was quickly subdued at gunpoint. What followed was a calculated, methodical attack that would become the signature of one of California's most feared criminals. The intruder wasn't just a burglar or a typical rapist. He was organized, prepared, and terrifyingly knowledgeable about his victims. He had brought shoelaces and rope to tie them up. He knew the layout of their home. He spoke in a barely audible whisper, and he wore a ski mask that concealed his identity completely. After the assault, he rummaged through their refrigerator, eating food and drinking beverages as if he owned the place. Then, as quietly as he had arrived, he vanished into the night. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was the work of someone who had been watching, planning, and preparing. The couple reported the attack to the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, but at the time, no one could have imagined that this was just the beginning of a crime spree that would terrorize California for over a decade. Over the next few months, similar attacks began occurring throughout the Sacramento area with alarming frequency. The pattern was always the same: a masked intruder would break into homes, usually targeting couples, and would spend hours terrorizing his victims. He would separate couples, tying up the male and taking the female to another room. His voice was always a harsh whisper, and he seemed to take particular pleasure in the psychological torture of his victims. By early 1977, Sacramento County Sheriff's Detective Richard Shelby had connected several of these attacks to the same perpetrator. The media dubbed him the East Area Rapist, and panic began to spread through Sacramento's suburban communities. Residents installed new locks, bought guns, and organized neighborhood watch groups. But the attacks continued. What made this case particularly chilling was the level of preparation the attacker showed. Victims reported that he seemed to know their schedules, when they would be home, and even personal details about their lives. He would often call his victims before and after the attacks, taunting them with his eerie whisper. Sometimes he would hang up when a male voice answered, suggesting he was conducting surveillance to determine when women would be alone. Detective Shelby and his team began to piece together a profile of their suspect. Based on witness descriptions and the athleticism required for some of his crimes, they believed he was a young white male, possibly in his 20s, physically fit, and highly organized. But despite their best efforts, he remained a ghost, striking at will and disappearing without a trace. By 1978, the East Area Rapist had committed over 30 attacks in the Sacramento area, but his reign of terror was far from over. In fact, it was about to get much worse. The attacks began to spread geographically, moving into the East Bay area around San Francisco. Contra Costa County, Fremont, and San Jose all reported similar crimes with the same MO. But something else was changing too: the level of violence was escalating. In October 1975, before the Sacramento attacks had even begun, an intruder had broken into the home of Claude Snelling in Visalia, about 200 miles south of Sacramento. When Snelling confronted the masked man who was attempting to kidnap his teenage daughter, he was shot and killed. At the time, this murder was attributed to a separate offender known as the Visalia Ransacker, but years later, investigators would realize they were dealing with the same perpetrator. The psychological profile of the offender was becoming clearer with each attack. He was methodical, patient, and seemed to derive as much pleasure from the fear he instilled as from the sexual assaults themselves. He would often spend hours in victims' homes, eating their food, rummaging through their belongings, and sometimes even doing laundry. He appeared to be studying his victims, learning about their lives in intimate detail. Detective Larry Crompton of the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office became one of the lead investigators as the crime spread into his jurisdiction. Crompton was struck by the offender's apparent military or law enforcement background. He moved silently, was skilled with knots and restraints, and showed tactical awareness that suggested professional training. In December 1979, the case took an even darker turn. In Goleta, near Santa Barbara, a young couple was brutally murdered in their home. Dr. Robert Offerman and Alexandria Manning were found shot to death, and the crime scene showed signs of the same methodical preparation that had characterized the East Area Rapist attacks. This marked the beginning of a new phase in the criminal's evolution. He was no longer content with sexual assault and burglary. He had become a killer. Over the next few years, similar double murders occurred throughout Southern California. In March 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith were bludgeoned to death in their Ventura home. In August 1980, Keith and Patrice Harrington were killed in Dana Point. The murders continued sporadically through 1986, with the final confirmed victims being Janelle Cruz in Irvine. These murders were initially investigated as separate cases by different law enforcement agencies. The killer, now dubbed the original Night Stalker, in Southern California to distinguish him from Richard Ramirez, who was also called the Night Stalker, seemed to have an uncanny ability to evade capture despite the massive law enforcement response. What investigators didn't realize at the time was that they were dealing with one extremely prolific offender who had simply changed his tactics and moved his hunting ground. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person, but it would be years before this connection was definitively made. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the investigation into these crimes continued, but progress was frustratingly slow. The cases had grown cold, and despite the best efforts of dozens of detectives across multiple jurisdictions, the perpetrator remained unidentified. Detective Larry Crompton retired from the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office but never stopped working the case. He wrote a book about the East Area Rapist, hoping to generate new leads and keep public attention focused on the crimes. Other investigators, both active and retired, formed informal networks to share information and theories. One of the most dedicated was investigator Paul Holes from the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office. Holes had joined the office as a forensic scientist in 1994 and became obsessed with the East Area Rapist case. He spent countless hours reviewing evidence, re-interviewing victims, and trying to develop new leads using emerging forensic technologies. The breakthrough everyone was hoping for came with the development of DNA analysis. By the late 1990s, crime labs were able to extract DNA profiles from evidence that had been collected decades earlier. The various law enforcement agencies working these cases began to submit their evidence for DNA testing, and the results were revelatory. In 2001, DNA evidence definitively linked the East Area Rapist attacks in Northern California to the original Night Stalker murders in Southern California. After more than 20 years, investigators finally had proof that they were dealing with a single offender. The cases were officially linked, and the combined investigation was reinvigorated. While law enforcement continued their official investigation, the case was also attracting attention from amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts. The most notable of these was Michelle McNamara, a writer and blogger who became deeply invested in the case. McNamara had started a blog called True Crime Diary, where she wrote about unsolved cases, but the East Area Rapist/original Night Stalker case became her obsession. She spent years researching every aspect of the crimes, creating detailed timelines, maps, and theories. She was in regular contact with investigators and victims, and her work helped keep public attention focused on the case. It was McNamara who coined the term Golden State Killer to refer to the perpetrator, arguing that the existing names were confusing and didn't adequately capture the scope of his crimes across the entire state. The name stuck, and the case became widely known by this moniker. Tragically, McNamara died suddenly in 2016 at the age of 46, before she could complete her book about the case. Her husband, comedian Patton Oswalt, worked with researchers to finish the book, which was published posthumously as I'll Be Gone in the Dark. The book became a bestseller and brought renewed attention to the Golden State Killer case. By 2017, investigator Paul Holes was nearing retirement, but he wasn't ready to give up on the Golden State Killer case. He had been following developments in genetic genealogy, a field that used DNA analysis in combination with genealogical research to identify unknown individuals. The technique had been pioneered by companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, which allowed consumers to upload their DNA profiles to databases and find genetic relatives. Holes realized that this same technology might be used to identify the Golden State Killer if they could find distant relatives of the perpetrator. Working with genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, Holes uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database. The profile didn't match anyone directly, but it did show potential distant relatives. Ray Venter began the painstaking process of building family trees for these individuals, looking for common ancestors who might be related to the killer. The work was incredibly complex and time-consuming. Ray Venter had to trace family lines back several generations, then follow them forward to identify all potential descendants. She looked for men of the right age who had lived in California during the time of the crimes and who had backgrounds that might fit the profile of the Golden State Killer. After months of work, one name kept appearing in her research: Joseph James DeAngelo. Joseph James DeAngelo was born in 1945 in Bath, New York, but his family had moved to California when he was young. He had served in the Navy and later became a police officer with the Exeter Police Department in 1973, and then with the Auburn Police Department from 1976 to 1979. The timeline was significant. His tenure with Auburn PD coincided exactly with the peak years of the East Area rapist attacks in Sacramento County. DeAngelo had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer from a drugstore. After his termination, he worked for a grocery distribution company and later as a mechanic at a truck shop. He had lived in various locations throughout California, including many of the areas where attacks had occurred. On paper, DeAngelo seemed to fit the profile investigators had developed over the years. He was the right age, had the right background, and had been in the right places at the right times. But they needed more than circumstantial evidence, they needed his DNA. On April 18, 2018, Paul Holes was attending a conference on investigative genetic genealogy when he received a call that would make his career. Investigators with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office had been conducting surveillance on DeAngelo and had collected discarded DNA samples from his trash. The lab had just confirmed a match to the Golden State Killer's DNA profile. That evening, law enforcement agencies across California coordinated a massive operation. DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, a Sacramento suburb, without incident. The 72-year-old former police officer seemed genuinely surprised by the arrest, and neighbors described him as a quiet, unremarkable man who kept to himself. The arrest sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and the public. After more than 40 years, one of California's most notorious serial killers had finally been identified and captured. The case that had frustrated generations of investigators had been solved using a combination of old-fashioned detective work and cutting-edge genetic technology. Following his arrest, DeAngelo was charged with 26 counts of murder and kidnapping related to crimes attributed to the Golden State Killer. Due to statutes of limitations, he could not be prosecuted for the sexual assaults, but the murder charges carried the possibility of the death penalty. As details of DeAngelo's life emerged, investigators began to understand how he had managed to evade capture for so long. His background in law enforcement had given him knowledge of police procedures and investigative techniques. He understood how evidence was collected and processed, and he had used this knowledge to avoid leaving traces that could be followed. Neighbors and former colleagues described DeAngelo as having fits of rage and being prone to angry outbursts, but many said they never suspected he could be capable of such horrific crimes. He had been married twice and had 3 daughters. His family expressed shock and disbelief at the charges. The legal proceedings moved slowly, as prosecutors and defense attorneys worked through the massive amount of evidence and the complex legal issues surrounding decades-old crimes. In June 2020, facing overwhelming DNA evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, DeAngelo agreed to plead guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping with the intent to commit robbery. On August 21, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo stood before a judge in a Sacramento courtroom for his sentencing hearing. The proceeding lasted 3 days, as dozens of victims and family members were given the opportunity to address their attacker directly. The impact statements were powerful and emotional. Survivors of his attacks, now in their 60s and 70s, spoke about the decades of fear and trauma they had endured. Family members of murder victims described the pain of losing loved ones and the frustration of waiting so long for justice. DeAngelo himself remained largely silent throughout the proceedings, showing little emotion as his victims confronted him. When given the opportunity to speak, he offered only a brief, seemingly perfunctory apology that many felt was inadequate given the scope of his crimes. Judge Michael Bowman sentenced DeAngelo to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that while D'Angelo had avoided the death penalty through his plea agreement, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, dying in prison as he deserved. The Golden State Killer case has had a profound impact on criminal investigation and forensic science. The use of investigative genetic genealogy to identify D'Angelo has opened up new possibilities for solving cold cases that were previously considered unsolvable. In the years since D'Angelo's arrest, dozens of other cold cases have been solved using similar techniques. The method has been used to identify suspects in murders, sexual assaults, and other serious crimes dating back decades. The success has been so dramatic that many law enforcement agencies have dedicated units specifically focused on genetic genealogy investigations. The case has also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence from old cases. DNA samples that were collected in the 1970s and 1980s, long before DNA analysis was possible, proved to be the key to solving these crimes. Many law enforcement agencies have since invested in better evidence storage and preservation systems. For the victims and their families, D'Angelo's conviction brought a measure of closure that many had thought would never come. While nothing could undo the trauma they had suffered, knowing that their attacker had finally been brought to justice provided some comfort and sense of resolution. The genetic genealogy technique that led to D'Angelo's identification represents a revolutionary advance in forensic science. Traditional DNA analysis can only identify a suspect if their DNA profile is already in a law enforcement database, such as CODI's Combined DNA Index System. But the vast majority of people have never had their DNA collected by law enforcement, so this approach has limited effectiveness. Genetic genealogy expands the pool of potential matches exponentially by using publicly available genealogy databases that contain DNA profiles from millions of people who have voluntarily submitted samples for family history research. Even if the perpetrator has never taken a DNA test, they may have relatives who have, and those relationships can be traced through careful genealogical research. The process is complex and time-consuming, requiring collaboration between forensic scientists, genealogists, and investigators. But when successful, it can identify suspects in cases that have been cold for decades. The technique has proven so effective that it has become a standard tool in many law enforcement agencies' investigative arsenal. The Golden State Killer case represents one of the most significant advances in criminal investigation in modern history. For more than 40 years, Joseph James D'Angelo terrorized California, committing at least 50 sexual assaults and 13 murders while successfully evading one of the largest investigations in the state's history. His ability to remain undetected for so long was due to a combination of factors: his knowledge of police procedures from his law enforcement background, his careful selection of victims and locations, his meticulous planning and preparation, and simple luck. But ultimately, it was science that brought him to justice. The case also demonstrates the importance of never giving up on seeking justice for victims of violent crime. Investigators like Paul Holes and Larry Crompton worked these cases for decades, often on their own time and without recognition. Their persistence, combined with advances in forensic technology, eventually led to D'Angelo's identification and arrest. For the survivors of D'Angelo's attacks and the families of his murder victims, his conviction represents the end of a nightmare that lasted for decades. While they can never get back the years of fear and uncertainty they endured, they can at least know that their attacker will never hurt anyone else. The Golden State Killer case has forever changed how law enforcement approaches cold cases. It has shown that no case is truly unsolvable, that evidence carefully preserved can speak across decades, and that advances in science can bring justice even when traditional investigative methods have been exhausted. As we close this chapter on one of California's most notorious serial killers, we're reminded that justice may sometimes be delayed, but with persistence, dedication, and the power of modern science, it need not be denied. Joseph James D'Angelo may have thought he had gotten away with his crimes, but in the end, the evidence he left behind 4 decades ago became the key to his downfall. Tonight, as residents of California sleep peacefully in their homes, they can rest easier knowing that the Golden State Killer is finally behind bars, where he will remain for the rest of his life. The reign of terror that began in 1976 has finally ended, and justice has been served. Story 5. And this is our last story for today. Tonight, we journey to the sun-soaked streets of Phoenix, Arizona, where the desert heat isn't the only thing that can make someone disappear without a trace. This is the story of Amanda Torres, a 28-year-old hiking blogger whose final post would lead investigators down a trail of digital breadcrumbs, secret relationships, and unanswered questions that continue to puzzle authorities today. Before we begin, I want to know if you're still with me, so if you're still with me, please comment, Story 5. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, take a deep breath. As we explore this mystery together, piece by piece, detail by detail. It was March 15, 2024, when Amanda Torres uploaded what would become her final Instagram post. The image showed the iconic red rocks of Papago Park at sunrise, with the caption, "Sometimes you have to get lost to find yourself. Tomorrow's adventure starts before dawn." #DesertSoul #FindYourPath. Amanda had been living in Phoenix for 3 years, having moved there from Portland, Oregon, seeking what she called a life less ordinary. She worked remotely as a graphic designer, which gave her the freedom to explore Arizona's endless hiking trails. Her Instagram account, @DesertWandererAZ, had grown to over 15,000 followers who eagerly awaited her stunning desert photography and thoughtful captions about solitude, self-discovery, and the healing power of nature. Those who knew Amanda described her as methodical, almost obsessive about planning. She researched every trail extensively, carried GPS devices, extra water, and always told someone where she was going. This attention to detail made what happened next all the more puzzling. On the morning of March 16, Amanda's landlord, Mrs. Chen, noticed something unusual. Amanda's silver Honda CR-V was still parked in its designated spot at the Desert Bloom Apartments on East Camelback Road. This was odd because Amanda typically left before sunrise for her weekend hikes, and she'd never missed her Saturday routine. Mrs. Chen, a retired teacher who'd become something of a surrogate grandmother to Amanda, decided to check on her. After knocking repeatedly with no response, she used her master key. The apartment was pristine, almost eerily so. Amanda's bed was made with military precision, her hiking gear was laid out on the kitchen counter as if prepared for an early morning departure, but Amanda was nowhere to be found. Detective Ray Morales of the Phoenix Police Department was assigned to the case on March 18, after Amanda had been officially reported missing by her worried parents in Oregon. Morales, a 15-year veteran with experience in missing persons cases, immediately recognized some troubling inconsistencies. Amanda's phone was missing, but her laptop remained open on her dining table, displaying a half-finished blog post titled, "The Trail Less Traveled, Finding Hidden Gems in the Sonoran Desert." The post described her plans to explore an unnamed trail she discovered through local knowledge, something that struck Morales as uncharacteristic, given Amanda's usual detailed trail descriptions and GPS coordinates. Her car keys were missing, but her car remained untouched. Her hiking backpack, always packed and ready, sat by the door. Most puzzling of all, Amanda's emergency contact list, a laminated card she kept on her refrigerator and updated religiously, had been removed. Only the faint outline of tape residue showed where it had been. Detective Morales began interviewing Amanda's neighbors at Desert Bloom Apartments. The complex, built in the 1990s, housed a mix of young professionals and retirees drawn to the area's proximity to hiking trails and the vibrant Arcadia neighborhood. Marcus Webb, who lived in the apartment below Amanda's, provided the first significant lead. A freelance photographer who often worked late nights, Marcus noticed something unusual on the evening of March 15. Around 11:30 p.m., he heard what sounded like muffled conversation coming from Amanda's apartment, unusual because Amanda typically went to bed early before her hiking days. "I remember thinking it was weird because Amanda was always so quiet," Marcus told Detective Morales. "She was like a ghost up there usually. But that night, there were definitely two voices, and one of them wasn't Amanda's. It was deeper, definitely a man's voice. I thought maybe she was watching a movie or something, but now, I don't know. As the investigation deepened, Detective Morales turned to Amanda's digital life for clues. With the help of a warrant, investigators accessed Amanda's phone records and social media accounts, revealing a complex web of online relationships that none of her friends or family knew about. Amanda's Instagram direct messages revealed she'd been in contact with someone calling themselves trailguide_AZ for approximately 2 months before her disappearance. The messages started innocuously enough: comments on her photos, recommendations for lesser-known trails, discussions about desert photography techniques. But as investigators scrolled through the conversation history, the tone gradually shifted. Trailguide_AZ began sharing more personal information, claiming to be a local park ranger with intimate knowledge of hidden trails not accessible to the general public. They shared stories of secret petroglyphs, hidden springs, and unmarked paths that led to some of the most spectacular views in Arizona. Amanda, always eager to discover new locations for her photography, became increasingly engaged in these conversations. The messages revealed her growing excitement about meeting this person, despite never having seen a clear photo of them. Trailguide_AZ's profile picture was an artistic shot of a sunrise over desert mountains, impossible to trace to any specific location. Cybercrime specialist Detective Lisa Park joined the investigation, bringing her expertise in digital forensics. Park discovered that the Trailguide_AZ account had been created specifically to contact Amanda. It had no other followers, no other conversations, and no posting history beyond interactions with Amanda. This shows clear premeditation, Detective Park explained to the investigation team. Someone created this account for the specific purpose of gaining Amanda's trust. They studied her posts, understood her interests, and crafted a persona designed to appeal to her adventurous nature. The final message from Trailguide_AZ, sent on March 15 at 9:47 p.m., simply read, "Ready for tomorrow's adventure? The sunrise from Devil's Backbone will change your life. Meet me at the usual spot, you know where." But investigators could find no previous reference to Devil's Backbone or any usual spot in their conversation history. Phoenix Search and Rescue mobilized on March 19, launching the most extensive desert search operation in the area in over a decade. The team, led by veteran coordinator Sarah Martinez, faced the daunting task of covering hundreds of square miles of Sonoran desert terrain. The search focused initially on Amanda's known favorite hiking areas, South Mountain Park, Camelback Mountain, and the McDowell Mountain Regional Park. Volunteers combed popular trails while helicopter crews scanned remote desert areas for any sign of Amanda or clues about her disappearance. Dr. James Peterson, a professor of desert ecology at Arizona State University, joined the search as a consultant. His knowledge of the desert's hidden geography proved invaluable as the team ventured into areas few people ever see. The thing about the Sonoran Desert, Dr. Peterson explained, is that it's full of places where someone could disappear completely. There are slot canyons, hidden washes, abandoned mine shafts from the early 1900s. Some of these areas haven't been thoroughly explored in decades. On the 4th day of searching, a significant discovery was made in the parking area near the Wind Cave Trail in Usuri Mountain Regional Park. Amanda's car keys were found partially buried under a Palo Verde tree, approximately 50 yards from the nearest parking space. The keys were examined for fingerprints, but the desert sun and wind had degraded any potential evidence. Strangely, analysis of the soil around the keys suggested they hadn't been there long, perhaps only 24 to 48 hours before discovery, meaning someone had placed them there well after Amanda's disappearance. This discovery shifted the investigation's focus from a simple missing hiker case to something far more complex. The search teams expanded their efforts, but the vast desert seemed to swallow their attempts to find answers. Each day brought new questions but no sign of Amanda Torres. As the search continued, Detective Morales delved deeper into Amanda's personal life, discovering layers of complexity that her cheerful social media presence had concealed. Amanda's closest friend in Phoenix, Sarah Kim, a yoga instructor she'd met at a local coffee shop, revealed that Amanda had been struggling with anxiety and depression since a difficult breakup the previous fall. Amanda was putting on a brave face, Sarah told Detective Morales during their interview at the small coffee shop in the Arcadia district where they used to meet every Tuesday morning. She'd moved to Phoenix to start over after her relationship ended badly in Portland. She never talked about the details, just said she needed to get away from someone who was making her life difficult. This revelation led investigators to contact Amanda's ex-boyfriend, Tyler Richardson, in Portland. Richardson, a software engineer, initially seemed cooperative but became evasive when asked about the nature of their breakup and whether he'd had any recent contact with Amanda. Phone records revealed that Tyler had indeed been in contact with Amanda, despite her telling friends she'd cut all ties with him. The calls were brief and infrequent, but they continued right up until 2 weeks before her disappearance. The final call lasted 47 minutes, unusually long for their recent pattern of communication. When pressed about this conversation, Tyler admitted that Amanda had been paranoid in recent months, claiming someone was following her online activities and possibly watching her apartment. He dismissed these concerns as anxiety-related, but now wondered if there had been truth to her fears. She kept saying someone was commenting on her posts too quickly, like they were monitoring her account constantly, Tyler revealed. She thought someone might be taking screenshots of her stories before she deleted them. I told her she was being paranoid, but maybe I should have listened. This information cast the trailguide_AZ interactions in a new light. The account's detailed knowledge of Amanda's preferences and the timing of their messages suggested intimate familiarity with her online behavior patterns. 2 weeks into the investigation, retired park ranger Elena Vasquez approached the Phoenix police with information that would add another layer to the mystery. Elena, who had worked in the Sonoran Desert for over 30 years before retiring in 2022, recognized the name Devil's Backbone from Amanda's final message exchange. Devil's Backbone isn't an official trail name, Elena explained to Detective Morales in her modest home near South Mountain Park. It's old slang, maybe 40 or 50 years old, for a dangerous ridge line in the Estrella Mountains. Local hikers used to call it that because it was so narrow and treacherous, like walking along the Devil's Spine. Elena's revelation was significant because the Estrella Mountains were not among Amanda's usual hiking destinations. The area was more remote, less trafficked, and required specialized knowledge to navigate safely. It was exactly the kind of hidden gem that would appeal to an experienced hiker looking for something new. Elena offered to guide a search team to the Devil's Backbone area, warning that it would be challenging terrain. The ridge was accessible only through unmarked desert paths, and several parts required technical climbing skills. It was not a place an inexperienced person would venture alone. The search team that followed Elena into the Estrella Mountains consisted of technical rescue specialists and experienced desert guides. What they found there would deepen the mystery surrounding Amanda's disappearance. Near the base of the ridge formation Elena identified as Devil's Backbone, searchers discovered evidence of recent camping activity. A small clearing showed signs of a campfire, and careful examination revealed fragments of what appeared to be burned paper. The paper fragments were too damaged to provide readable text, but chemical analysis would later confirm they contained ink consistent with printed photographs. More puzzling was the discovery of a single hiking boot, size 7.5, Amanda's size, partially concealed under a desert broom bush approximately half a mile from the camping area. The boot showed signs of recent wear but was in relatively good condition, not consistent with extended exposure to desert conditions. The boot's location made no logical sense. It was nowhere near any established trail, in an area that would require careful navigation to reach, and positioned in a way that suggested intentional concealment rather than accidental loss. As news of Amanda's disappearance spread through Phoenix's hiking community, an interesting pattern emerged. Several other female hikers came forward with stories of being contacted by suspicious social media accounts that seemed remarkably similar to trailguide_AZ. Jennifer Walsh, a 32-year-old teacher and avid hiker, reported that she'd been contacted by an account called desert_guide_Phoenix 3 months earlier. The conversation followed an almost identical pattern to Amanda's experience: initial trail recommendations, gradually increasing personal questions, and eventually an invitation to meet for a sunrise hike at an unnamed location. "Something felt off about the whole thing," Jennifer told Detective Morales. "The person seemed to know too much about my hiking schedule, commenting on posts within minutes of me uploading them. I blocked the account when they started asking about whether I hiked alone and where I lived." Similar reports came from 4 other women, all between the ages of 25 and 35, all solo hikers who frequently posted about their desert adventures. The accounts that contacted them had different names but followed the same pattern: recently created profiles, minimal posting history, and an intense focus on hidden or secret trails. Detective Park's analysis revealed that all these accounts were created from the same IP address, traced to a public Wi-Fi network at a popular coffee shop in Tempe. Security cameras from the shop were reviewed, but the footage was automatically deleted after 30 days, meaning any evidence from the account creation dates was long gone. The hiking community's response to Amanda's disappearance was swift and organized. A Facebook group called Find Amanda Torres grew to over 3,000 members within a week. Local hiking clubs organized search parties, distributed flyers, and shared Amanda's story across social media platforms. But the community effort also revealed something troubling. Several experienced hikers mentioned encounters with a man they described as overly interested in female hikers' plans and routes. The descriptions were vague and inconsistent, but they painted a picture of someone who frequented popular trailheads, engaged lone female hikers in conversation, and seemed to have extensive knowledge of remote desert areas. These reports were too scattered and generic to provide solid leads, but they suggested that Amanda's disappearance might be part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior targeting solo female hikers in the Phoenix area. 6 weeks after Amanda's disappearance, the investigation took an unexpected turn when Detective Morales received a call from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. A maintenance worker at a remote cell tower in the Estrella Mountains had discovered something unusual while performing routine equipment checks. Hidden behind the tower's equipment housing, investigators found a small weatherproof case containing several items that would prove crucial to understanding Amanda's fate. Inside were a damaged smartphone, later confirmed to be Amanda's, a digital camera with its memory card removed, and a handwritten note that would chill everyone who read it. The note, written in Amanda's distinctive handwriting, was brief but devastating: "If someone finds this, know that I trusted the wrong person. Trail guide isn't who he claims to be. I think I'm in danger. The sunrise meeting was a trap. Tell my parents I love them." The phone, despite severe water damage, yielded additional clues when examined by digital forensics specialists. The last location recorded by the device's GPS was near the Devil's Backbone area, but at a timestamp that was hours before Amanda was supposedly scheduled to meet trailguide_AZ. This timing discrepancy suggested that Amanda had discovered something about her online contact that made her fear for her safety, but by then it was too late to avoid the meeting. Detective Park's continued analysis of the trailguide_AZ account revealed additional disturbing information. The account had been accessing Amanda's location data through a hiking app they both used, allowing whoever controlled it to track her movements in real time. This explained how the person knew so much about Amanda's hiking patterns and favorite locations. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that trailguide_AZ had been taking screenshots of Amanda's Instagram stories and saving them to a cloud storage account. The account contained hundreds of images of Amanda, often cropped to focus on her face or body, suggesting an obsessive level of attention that went far beyond casual interest in her hiking adventures. The investigation had evolved from a missing person case to something far more sinister: a carefully planned stalking and abduction that had been months in the making. Today, more than 8 months after Amanda Torres vanished into the Sonoran Desert, her case remains open and active. The Phoenix Police Department continues to follow leads, and the search for Amanda, or answers about her fate, has not been abandoned. Detective Morales, now working with federal authorities due to the case's potential connection to online predators, believes that solving Amanda's disappearance is key to preventing similar crimes. The investigation has led to increased awareness about online safety in hiking communities across the Southwest. The case has also sparked changes in how social media platforms monitor and respond to suspicious account activity targeting solo travelers and outdoor enthusiasts. Amanda's story has become a cautionary tale about the intersection of digital connectivity and physical vulnerability. Mrs. Chen still maintains Amanda's apartment exactly as it was the day she disappeared, hoping for her eventual return. Amanda's parents have established a foundation in her name, focusing on educating solo hikers about safety and supporting search and rescue operations in the desert Southwest. The hiking trails Amanda loved continue to draw adventurers seeking solitude and natural beauty in the Sonoran Desert. But her disappearance serves as a reminder that even in our connected age, it's possible to vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the hope that someday, the desert will reveal its secrets. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps take a moment to appreciate the safety of your own bed, the comfort of known surroundings, and the peace that comes with being exactly where you're supposed to be. Amanda's story reminds us that adventure and caution must walk hand in hand, and that sometimes the most dangerous trails are the ones we can't see coming. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.